A Prince Beneath the Stars. Tonight, I want you to imagine England long before neat green fields were divided by tidy hedges, before steam trains crossed the countryside, before clocks ruled every waking moment. Imagine instead a land of muddy roads disappearing beneath endless rain, villages huddled beneath crooked church towers, forests so thick that moonlight struggled to reach the ground, and castles standing on lonely hills like giant stones dropped there by forgotten gods. Somewhere in that sleeping landscape, a watchman pulls his wool cloak tighter against the cold wind. The torches along the castle walls hiss softly as rain drifts through the darkness. Horses stamp inside damp stables. Somewhere a blacksmith's fire still glows, refusing to surrender to the night. Bells ring the final prayers before silence settles across the kingdom. Above, everything stretches a sky crowded with stars. Those same stars look down upon one of medieval England's greatest warriors, a prince who would become both admired and feared across Europe. His victories inspired songs. His enemies whispered his name with equal measures of hatred and respect. Chroniclers called him the perfect knight. Later generations would remember him by a title almost everyone recognizes: the Black Prince. It sounds like the name of a villain in an old fairy tale, doesn't it? A shadow riding through mist on a jet black horse, perhaps carrying a cursed sword while ravens circle overhead. Reality, as it usually does, was far more complicated. Edward of Woodstock, the man history remembers as the Black Prince, was never actually king of England. Despite being the eldest son of one of England's greatest monarchs, he died before inheriting the throne. He spent his life winning battles for a kingdom he would never rule. There is something strangely poetic about that. Imagine climbing every mountain only to stop a single step before the summit. History has a habit of doing that to people. Sometimes the greatest figures are remembered not for the crowns they wore, but for the ones they never reached. And so tonight, as the wind sighs around stone towers and the candles burn low, we are going to spend time with Edward, not merely the legendary commander charging across battlefields beneath fluttering banners, but the child who laughed in palace corridors, the young prince who carried impossible expectations, the husband who hoped for peace, the father who worried for his son, and eventually, the weary man whose body betrayed him long before his spirit surrendered. Because history often prefers statues, but real people were never made of marble. They were made of flesh that grew tired, bones that broke, hearts that hoped, and fears they tried very hard to hide. If you listen carefully enough to the Middle Ages, beyond the clanging armor and dramatic speeches that movies adore, you begin to hear quieter sounds. Rain dripping from castle roofs, monks scratching ink across parchment, dogs barking beyond village walls, children chasing each other through muddy streets, merchants arguing over the price of wool, women stirring thick stews over smoky fires. Life continued, even while kings planned wars. Most medieval people would never meet a prince. Many never traveled farther than the next market town. Yet decisions made inside distant castles shaped every harvest, every tax, every son's future. Edward was born into that enormous machine of medieval politics, not simply as another noble child. He arrived carrying expectations heavier than chainmail. From his first breath, people looked at him and saw the future of England. No pressure, naturally. Being the heir to a kingdom was rather like being handed the steering wheel of a ship during a storm before learning how sails actually worked. Everyone expected greatness. Everyone watched. Everyone judged. Failure wasn't merely personal. Failure could become national catastrophe. The 14th century was not a gentle place to grow up. Europe itself seemed permanently exhausted. Famines had scarred entire generations only decades earlier. Weather shifted unpredictably. Harvests sometimes failed without warning. Disease lurked everywhere. Medicine consisted largely of hope mixed with herbs whose effectiveness varied somewhere between possibly helpful and please stop doing that. Meanwhile, politics resembled an elaborate family argument in which everyone happened to own armies. Kings married foreign princesses. Princes inherited distant lands. Dukes switched sides. Popes argued with emperors. Neighbors invaded neighbors. Then everybody signed treaties that lasted approximately until next Tuesday. It was wonderfully complicated. Unless, of course, you actually lived through it. Then it was mostly terrifying. England itself was changing. Castles grew larger. Parliament slowly found its voice. Trade expanded across seas. The English language evolved every generation, absorbing French words after the Norman conquest, until conversations became linguistic patchwork quilts stitched together over centuries. Knights still dreamed of glory. Poets still sang of honor. But underneath polished armor lay economic anxieties, political rivalries, and ambitions capable of igniting entire continents. Edward entered this world in the year 1330. At that exact moment, no one knew history would remember him. Infants rarely appear extraordinary. They mostly cry. Sleep. Cry again. Demand food at inconvenient hours. Future heroes are surprisingly ordinary at the beginning. The legends come later. Often much later. His birthplace was Woodstock Palace in Oxfordshire, a royal residence surrounded by forests where kings hunted deer and escaped the pressures of London. Imagine broad stone halls warmed by blazing fireplaces. Tapestries covered walls to keep out winter drafts. Rushes scattered across floors softened footsteps and absorbed, well, many things medieval people preferred not to discuss too closely. Outside stretched royal hunting grounds alive with red deer, wild boar, foxes, wolves in distant forests, and birds filling dawn skies with song. This landscape shaped childhood. Royal children learned to ride almost before walking confidently. They handled bows while still young. They watched falconers train hawks. They followed hunts through forests where every broken branch might reveal prey. Nature itself became classroom. Strength became expectation. Courage became routine. Edward's father was King Edward III, a monarch who possessed extraordinary energy and equally extraordinary ambition. He believed England deserved greatness, preferably the sort involving military victories, preferably against France. Actually, especially against France. As for his mother, Philippa of Hainaut, she brought warmth often absent from royal courts. Contemporary writers praised her kindness, intelligence, and generosity. While kings frequently occupied themselves conquering territories, queens quietly maintained families, negotiated disputes, managed households, and reminded powerful men that children occasionally required attention. Philippa excelled at precisely that. She would become one of the most respected queens England ever knew. Young Edward inherited qualities from both parents. From his father came determination. From his mother came compassion. Though history, being fascinated with battles, tends to spend considerably more ink describing the first than the second. The palace where he grew up never truly slept. Servants hurried through corridors carrying firewood. Messengers arrived covered in mud after riding for days. Priests held services before sunrise. Cooks prepared astonishing quantities of food. Tailors measured noble children whose bodies inconveniently insisted upon growing. Armorers hammered steel into elegant shapes. Scribes copied letters by candlelight until their eyes burned. Somewhere someone always shouted. Somewhere someone always prayed. Somewhere someone always worried. A medieval royal household resembled a small traveling city. Hundreds of people surrounded one family. Everyone depended upon everyone else. The prince learned names, faces, voices. He watched loyalty rewarded. He watched mistakes punished. He observed diplomacy unfolding not inside classrooms, but across dining tables where smiles often concealed dangerous intentions. Children notice more than adults realize. Edward almost certainly absorbed these lessons silently. One day they would guide armies. But that future remained invisible. For now, he simply explored corridors wider than village streets. He chased dogs through courtyards. He listened to traveling musicians. He stared at brightly painted shields hanging from castle walls. Perhaps he wondered whether knights ever grew frightened. Perhaps he imagined dragons hiding beyond distant hills. Children of every century ask surprisingly similar questions. Only the scenery changes. Night after night, England settled beneath darkness. Owls hunted silently. Monasteries echoed with midnight prayers. Ships rocked gently in harbors. Farmers slept before another exhausting sunrise. And somewhere inside royal chambers, a small boy dreamed dreams no different from countless others. He could not know that one day thousands would cheer his victories. He could not know chroniclers would preserve his deeds. He certainly could not know that people nearly 7 centuries later would still whisper his nickname in documentaries, books, museums, and conversations across the world. History has that peculiar habit. It selects ordinary mornings, ordinary children, ordinary conversations, then quietly transforms them into legend. The stars above medieval England remained unchanged. Empires rose beneath them. Kings died beneath them. Entire generations vanished while those distant lights continued burning with indifferent patience. Edward's life, magnificent though it became, occupied only a brief moment beneath that immense sky. Perhaps that is why his story still resonates. Not because he was invincible, not because he became king, not even because he won remarkable battles, but because his life reminds us that greatness and tragedy often travel together. Sometimes the brightest banners cast the longest shadows. And before Edward became the Black Prince, before Crécy, before Poitiers, before Europe learned to fear the young commander in shining armor, he was simply a little boy growing up in a kingdom preparing, whether it realized it or not, for one of the longest wars in European history. So let the castle doors open slowly. Let the candles flicker against ancient stone. Let the forests of 14th century England awaken in the pale light of dawn. Our journey is only beginning. England before the Black Prince. The morning arrives slowly over 14th century England, not with the sudden brightness of an electric switch, but as a gradual surrender of darkness. Mist hangs low over rivers and meadows, clinging to the earth as though reluctant to leave. Dew gathers on blades of grass, each droplet catching the first pale hints of sunlight. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster announces the dawn with all the confidence of a creature who genuinely believes he controls the sun. The villagers politely allow him to think so. Smoke begins to curl from the chimneys of timber cottages roofed with straw. Bakers knead dough by candlelight, their hands working almost automatically after years of repetition. The smell of fresh bread drifts into narrow lanes still muddy from yesterday's rain. Shepherds gather their flocks. Blacksmiths stir dying embers back into glowing life. Church bells echo across the countryside, calling people toward morning prayers before another day of labor begins. This is England in the early 14th century. Not yet the mighty empire that would one day stretch across oceans, but already a kingdom full of ambition, contradiction, and quiet determination. To understand Edward of Woodstock, we first have to understand the world that shaped him. Because people do not emerge from history like statues appearing from empty fields. They are products of their age. And the age into which Edward was born was anything but peaceful. If medieval Europe were a family gathering, it would be one where every cousin believed they deserved the biggest inheritance, every uncle carried a sword, and someone inevitably flipped the dinner table before dessert. Inheritance, after all, was serious business. Kings did not simply rule because they were clever or brave. They ruled because bloodlines, marriages, promises, and ancient claims tangled together like the roots of an old oak tree. Pull on one branch, and kingdoms trembled hundreds of miles away. France and England had spent generations connected in exactly this complicated fashion. The roots stretched back to 1066, when William, Duke of Normandy, crossed the English Channel and conquered England. Ever since then, English kings had worn two very different hats. One hat proclaimed them sovereign rulers of England. The other reminded them they still possessed lands in France, lands technically held from the French king. Imagine being both your neighbor's equal and his tenant at the same time. It was an arrangement that worked about as smoothly as you might expect. Every generation inherited the same awkward question: who was really in charge? The answer depended largely upon who had the larger army that particular year. By Edward's childhood, these tensions had simmered for decades. French kings wanted stronger control over territories like Gascony in southwestern France. English kings insisted those lands belonged to them through ancient rights. Neither side wished to compromise. Naturally, because medieval monarchs generally considered compromise a charming concept best practiced by other people. At court, maps became political weapons. A painted river or castle could represent enormous wealth. Fields of vineyards meant taxes. Ports meant trade. Forests meant timber for ships. A single province might support thousands of families. Losing land was not simply embarrassing. It threatened the very foundations of royal authority. Meanwhile, ordinary people continued tending sheep. History often works that way. Kings debate borders. Farmers wonder whether it will rain. England itself was changing in quieter ways as well. Wool had become the kingdom's greatest treasure. Not gold. Not silver. Sheep. Thousands upon thousands of remarkably fluffy economic assets wandered across rolling hills. English wool was famous throughout Europe. Merchants carried great bales of it to the weaving towns of Flanders, where skilled craftsmen transformed raw fleece into luxurious cloth. That cloth traveled onward to wealthy customers across the continent. A sheep grazing peacefully in Yorkshire might eventually help produce an elegant cloak worn by a merchant in Venice. The medieval economy was surprisingly interconnected. Money flowed alongside rivers and sea routes. Markets bustled with languages from distant lands. Italian bankers lent money to English kings. Flemish merchants bought English wool. Spanish sailors unloaded wine. German traders carried metal goods. Pilgrims, scholars, soldiers, monks, and wandering musicians all crossed paths upon dusty roads. The world was larger than most villagers ever saw, yet it constantly reached into their lives. Royal taxes increased. Prices shifted. Wars interrupted trade. Everyone felt the consequences, even if they never understood the reasons. London, although much smaller than today, already stood as England's beating heart. Imagine approaching the city from the countryside. Long before reaching its walls, you would smell it. Wood smoke. Tanneries. Breweries. Horse manure. Fish markets. Open sewers. Fresh bread. Wet timber. Thousands of people living together create a fragrance that historians politely describe as authentic. Within the city walls, narrow streets twisted unpredictably between wooden buildings that leaned toward one another overhead. Shopkeepers shouted. Children ran through crowds. Dogs barked. Carts rattled over uneven stones. Church bells competed with street vendors selling pies, cloth, candles, herbs, and ale. Everything felt alive. Everything also felt crowded. Fire remained a constant fear. Most buildings were timber, roofs often thatched. One careless candle, one overturned cooking pot, one unlucky spark. Entire neighborhoods could vanish before sunset. Yet London grew anyway. Prosperity has a curious ability to attract people despite obvious dangers. Royal officials filled government offices. Lawyers argued cases. Foreign merchants negotiated contracts. Craft guilds protected their trades. Monasteries copied precious manuscripts. Every street seemed to tell a different story. Somewhere among them walked boys who dreamed of becoming knights. Others dreamed merely of becoming successful bakers. Neither ambition was guaranteed. Life expectancy remained uncertain. Disease visited frequently. Accidents happened daily. The future always felt fragile. Religion offered certainty where little else could. The church touched every aspect of existence. Bells marked the hours. Saints filled calendars. Feast days interrupted work. Fast days interrupted meals. Birth, marriage, illness, harvest, death. Every important moment carried religious meaning. Towering cathedrals dominated skylines, their stone walls rising impossibly high above surrounding houses. Colored glass windows transformed ordinary sunlight into rivers of blue, crimson, and gold. Incense drifted through cool interiors while choirs sang Latin words most worshippers could not fully understand. Yet perhaps understanding every word mattered less than feeling part of something eternal. Faith gave rhythm to uncertain lives. Even kings bowed before God, at least in theory. Reality occasionally proved more negotiable. The monasteries scattered across England became islands of learning. Within quiet stone walls, monks preserved books copied painstakingly by hand. One page, one line, one careful letter after another. Imagine spending months copying a single manuscript, then discovering a mouse had eaten the corner. Patience was not simply a virtue. It was an occupational necessity. Without these patient scribes, much of ancient knowledge might have disappeared forever. They copied scripture, classical philosophy, medicine, astronomy, history itself. Ironically, many of the stories we know about fierce medieval warriors survive because peaceful monks possessed exceptionally neat handwriting. Outside monastery walls, however, another education unfolded: the education of arms. England valued knights enormously. From childhood, noble boys trained relentlessly, first as pages, then as squires. Finally, if fortunate, as knights. The journey demanded discipline: riding, swordsmanship, archery, hunting, courtly manners, religious instruction, leadership, even dancing. Yes, dancing. A knight expected to impress both on the battlefield and in the Great Hall, preferably without stepping on anyone's feet in either location. Armor itself represented astonishing craftsmanship. Forget the image of clumsy warriors barely able to move. Well-made plate armor balanced protection with flexibility. Experienced knights mounted horses unaided. They fought on foot when necessary. They climbed ladders during sieges. They even ran. Briefly. Before remembering, armor remained rather heavy after all. Every sword required constant maintenance. Every helmet needed repairs. Every horse demanded expensive care. War was breathtakingly costly. Only the wealthy could truly afford it. Behind every shining knight stood armorers, blacksmiths, leatherworkers, stable boys, servants, and craftsmen whose names history rarely recorded. Glory, as usual, depended upon invisible labor. No medieval army marched without bread, or horseshoes, or barrels, or thousands of ordinary workers. Then there was the weather. Ah yes, England's favorite conversation topic. Some traditions never change. Rain shaped medieval life more than kings sometimes did. Roads became rivers of mud. Harvests succeeded or failed. Armies moved slowly. Castles turned damp. Clothing rarely dried completely. Everyone accepted wet feet as an unavoidable feature of existence. Winters could be brutally cold. Summers occasionally glorious. Autumn painted forests gold before stripping branches bare. Spring transformed muddy fields into seas of wildflowers. Nature governed the calendar. No decree from London could persuade wheat to grow faster. People adapted. They always do. Royal hunting forests stretched across large parts of England. These woodlands were not simply collections of trees. They represented law, power, privilege. Only the king enjoyed unrestricted hunting rights within royal forests. Peasants caught poaching deer risked severe punishment. Imagine living beside abundant game while your family struggled through winter hunger. Temptation must have whispered constantly. Many listened. Some paid dearly. The forests themselves seemed ancient beyond memory. Massive oaks shaded winding paths. Wild boar rooted beneath fallen leaves. Foxes slipped silently through undergrowth. Wolves still survived in remote regions. Birdsong greeted dawn. Owls ruled the night. Children raised near these woods grew up believing every shadow concealed possibility or danger. Often both. This was also an age of stories. Long before printed books reached ordinary homes, tales traveled by voice. Minstrels wandered from castle to castle singing of Arthur, Charlemagne, Roland, and legendary heroes whose courage somehow grew greater with every retelling. Naturally, no bard ever announced, "Our hero fought reasonably well before withdrawing to reconsider his options." That rarely earned applause. Instead, dragons became larger. Battles became grander. Kings became wiser. History blurred gently into legend. Young Edward almost certainly heard these stories. He listened beside crackling fires while musicians plucked harps and storytellers painted entire worlds using nothing but words. Perhaps those tales shaped his imagination. Perhaps they convinced him that honor mattered. Or perhaps they simply entertained a restless boy after supper. Either way, stories possess remarkable power. They teach people who they believe they ought to become. England believed in knights. It believed in courage. It believed that noble birth carried noble responsibility. Reality frequently disappointed those ideals. But ideals matter precisely because they are difficult to achieve. Edward would spend his entire life chasing them, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. And somewhere beyond the English Channel, another kingdom watched. France. Richer. More populous. Confident. Its castles overlooked fertile plains stretching farther than the eye could see. Great cities flourished behind mighty walls. Noble families guarded ancient traditions. Powerful kings strengthened royal authority year after year. Neither kingdom yet understood how deeply their destinies would become intertwined. Neither guessed that children growing up on opposite sides of the channel would someday meet upon battlefields where thousands would fall beneath banners snapping in the wind. The stage was almost prepared. The actors were still young. The curtain had not yet risen. But history, patient as ever, was quietly arranging every piece. Because before Edward of Woodstock could become the legendary Black Prince, before the thunder of cavalry, before the longbows darkened the sky, before Europe spoke his name with awe, he first had to grow from a curious child into a young man beneath the careful eyes of England's ambitious king. And that is where our story turns next, into the halls of Woodstock Palace, where a prince's education truly begins, and where the weight of a crown, still many years away, already rested invisibly upon his shoulders. The birth and childhood of Edward of Woodstock. Morning sunlight filtered through the narrow windows of Woodstock Palace in thin golden ribbons, illuminating tiny flecks of dust that drifted lazily through the air. Somewhere below, servants had already begun the endless rhythm of another royal day. Buckets splashed against stone floors. Horses snorted impatiently in their stables. A cook argued with an apprentice over the freshness of yesterday's fish, a debate that, given medieval refrigeration technology, was rather important. The castle was awake. Soon enough, so was its youngest prince. Edward of Woodstock entered the world on the 15th of June, 1330, at a remarkable moment in England's history. His father, King Edward III, was only 17 years old. It is easy to forget that kings could be astonishingly young. We often imagine monarchs as gray-haired figures seated upon ancient thrones, dispensing wisdom between dramatic pauses. Edward III was practically still growing up himself. His kingdom, meanwhile, was caught between uncertainty and opportunity. Only months before his son's birth, the young king had seized power from the regency that had ruled in his name. England had endured years of political turmoil under the influence of Roger Mortimer and Queen Isabella, Edward III's own mother. Court politics had become tangled with betrayal, ambition, imprisonment, and executions. As medieval family disagreements went, this was certainly one of the more dramatic ones. Roger Mortimer had once been the most powerful man in England. Then he wasn't. Such was the occupational hazard of standing too close to a throne. Power in medieval Europe could disappear almost overnight. One evening you dined in magnificent halls. The next morning you discovered the king had changed his mind. And perhaps your residence. And perhaps your heartbeat. The infant Edward would never remember those turbulent events, of course. Babies rarely concern themselves with constitutional crises. Their priorities tend to remain wonderfully consistent. Warmth. Food. Sleep. Repeat. Yet the political stability restored by his father would shape every year of his childhood. Edward III possessed something many successful rulers shared: confidence. Not arrogance, although medieval chroniclers occasionally blurred that distinction, but genuine confidence in his purpose. He believed England could become stronger, wealthier, and more respected among European kingdoms. He also believed that achieving this might require winning rather a great many wars. Because naturally, kings have always preferred ambitious construction projects. Some build cathedrals, others build armies. Edward III proved surprisingly talented at both. The royal nursery occupied rooms warmer and brighter than much of the castle. Thick tapestries covered stone walls, softening drafts that slipped through ancient masonry. Fires burned almost constantly during winter months. Candles flickered gently after sunset, casting dancing shadows across painted ceilings. Life here was comfortable by medieval standards, which admittedly is rather like saying someone owned the nicest card in the village. Comfort remained relative. The windows admitted plenty of fresh air. They also admitted plenty of cold air. Privacy scarcely existed. Servants entered constantly. Nurses watched every movement. Wet nurses cared for infants. Physicians visited regularly. Priests offered blessings. Messengers arrived with news. Royal children never experienced solitude. Even sleeping became a public affair. The future of a dynasty rested in tiny hands. Everyone wanted reassurance that those hands remained healthy. Edward's mother, Philippa of Hainaut, quickly became one of the kingdom's most beloved queens. Born far from England in what is now Belgium, she had traveled across the sea as a young bride, entering a foreign land whose language, customs, and politics differed greatly from her own. Imagine leaving everything familiar forever. No modern communication. No quick journey home. No photographs of loved ones. Only memory. Philippa adapted with remarkable grace. Contemporary chroniclers praised not merely her beauty but her kindness, generosity, intelligence, and calm temperament. Unlike many medieval queens remembered primarily for political intrigues, Philippa earned affection through simple humanity. She listened. She gave generously to the poor. She intervened when mercy seemed appropriate. She remained devoted to her family. In a royal court where ambition often echoed louder than compassion, those qualities stood out. Young Edward adored her. Although medieval parents often entrusted daily childcare to nurses and attendants, Philippa took a genuine interest in raising her children. She and Edward III would eventually have 13 children together. 13. One cannot help admiring their energy. The royal household must have resembled a particularly enthusiastic schoolroom. Children laughing in corridors. Lessons beginning before breakfast. Dogs chasing one another through courtyards. Tutors desperately attempting to maintain order. Some things, it seems, transcend every century. Edward, as the eldest son, naturally attracted the greatest attention. From infancy, everyone understood his future. He would inherit England. Not perhaps. Not if circumstances allowed. Barring tragedy, he would someday become king. That certainty shaped every conversation surrounding him. Every tutor chosen. Every lesson planned. Every expectation whispered in palace halls. It is difficult to imagine growing up beneath such invisible pressure. Every stumble observed. Every success celebrated. Every mistake remembered. Children today occasionally feel anxious about school examinations. Edward's final examination involved governing an entire kingdom. No pressure indeed. His earliest years unfolded against the backdrop of Woodstock's forests. Royal hunting grounds surrounded the palace in every direction. Massive oak trees shaded winding paths where deer moved quietly among ferns. Birds nested high in ancient branches. Streams reflected fragments of sky through tangled leaves. These woods became Edward's playground. Unlike many modern children whose adventures unfold upon carefully designed playgrounds, medieval princes explored landscapes alive with genuine unpredictability. They climbed fallen trees. They followed animal tracks. They watched falconers train hunting birds. They learned which plants could heal wounds, which berries should remain untouched, which sounds belonged to harmless creatures, which suggested something considerably larger. Nature served as both teacher and companion. The prince developed a lifelong love of hunting. This was hardly surprising. For medieval nobility, hunting represented far more than entertainment. It taught patience, observation, endurance, horsemanship, leadership. A successful hunt required coordination among dozens of people and animals. Dogs flushed prey. Falcons struck from above. Riders maneuvered across difficult terrain. Servants followed carrying supplies. Everything depended upon teamwork. Many skills learned during the hunt later proved valuable upon battlefields. Although admittedly deer rarely shot arrows back. Edward's education began almost as soon as he could speak clearly. Medieval nobles believed idle children quickly became troublesome adults. There was always something useful to learn. Morning prayers came first. Religion formed the foundation of every noble education. Priests taught scripture, Latin prayers, and the moral responsibilities expected of Christian rulers. The young prince learned that kings ruled not merely through strength, but through divine responsibility. Power required justice. Authority required humility. Reality, of course, occasionally wandered away from these ideals. But the lessons remained. After prayers came language. Edward grew up hearing several tongues every day. English filled kitchens, stables, and village streets. French dominated the royal court, remaining the language of aristocracy ever since the Norman conquest. Latin belonged to the church, scholarship, diplomacy, and official documents. Imagine being expected to speak 3 languages before reaching adulthood. Quite an impressive curriculum, especially considering there were no language learning apps. Only patient tutors. Reading and writing followed. Books remained rare and extraordinarily expensive. Every page had been copied painstakingly by hand upon parchment made from animal skins. Ink itself represented valuable craftsmanship. Children learned to treat books with profound respect. Dropping one into a puddle would have been unpopular, to put it mildly. Yet Edward's education extended far beyond books. He learned to ride almost before reaching the saddle comfortably. Small ponies carried him across palace grounds while experienced riders walked nearby, ready to prevent spectacular disasters. Balance came first. Confidence followed. Soon enough, he guided horses independently. The connection between rider and horse became second nature. One day it might save his life. Archery lessons began while he remained quite young. Although English longbowmen would eventually become legendary, noble boys usually received broader military instruction. Edward practiced with bows, swords carved from wood, small spears, and shields appropriately sized for growing arms. At first, these exercises resembled games. Children chased targets, competed against one another, laughed after missed shots. Gradually, the games became discipline. Movements repeated endlessly until they became instinct. Mastery requires repetition. Even princes discovered this inconvenient truth. Physical fitness mattered enormously. Modern gymnasiums had not yet appeared, fortunately for everyone involved. Instead, exercise blended naturally into daily life. Riding, running, swimming, climbing, wrestling, hunting. Every activity strengthened muscles while teaching useful skills. A prince unable to endure hardship inspired little confidence among future soldiers. Edward's instructors understood this perfectly. Comfort rarely entered the curriculum. Winter mornings remained cold. Lessons continued anyway. Rain-soaked clothing. Training continued anyway. Horses misbehaved. Training continued anyway. Discipline often means continuing despite inconvenience. The medieval world appreciated that lesson perhaps more than ours sometimes does. Yet childhood was not entirely duty. Far from it. The palace echoed with laughter as often as commands. Edward played games with his brothers and sisters. He raced across courtyards. He listened to traveling musicians performing heroic songs accompanied by harps and flutes. He watched jugglers toss knives with alarming enthusiasm. He marveled at trained bears, monkeys brought from distant lands, colorful parrots, and other exotic creatures occasionally presented as diplomatic gifts. Imagine seeing an elephant for the first time after believing such animals existed only in stories. The medieval world still possessed countless wonders. Festivals transformed ordinary days into celebrations. Christmas filled great halls with evergreen branches, music, feasting, and candlelight. Easter brought solemn ceremonies followed by joyful gatherings. Saints' feast days interrupted routine with processions, tournaments, games, and communal meals. Children remembered these occasions for years afterward. Even kings required moments of happiness. One of Edward's greatest influences remained his father. Edward III believed deeply in the ideals of knighthood: honor, loyalty, courage, generosity, protection of the weak. He admired the legends of King Arthur so passionately that he deliberately modeled parts of his court upon Arthurian ideals. Eventually, he established the Order of the Garter, England's highest order of chivalry. Young Edward watched all this unfold. He saw knights swear solemn oaths. He watched tournaments where armored horsemen thundered toward one another beneath colorful banners. He observed ceremonies rich with symbolism and ancient tradition. The pageantry dazzled him. But beneath the glitter lay a serious purpose. His father wished England's nobility to become more than wealthy landowners. He wanted them united by shared ideals. Whether every knight lived up to those ideals is another matter entirely. Human beings have always excelled at inventing noble principles. Following them consistently proves rather more difficult. Still, the vision mattered, and it profoundly shaped the young prince's understanding of leadership. By the time Edward approached his 10th birthday, something remarkable had become apparent. He possessed unusual confidence. Not reckless confidence, not boastfulness. A quiet certainty. He listened carefully, learned quickly, wrote exceptionally well, displayed natural authority without appearing cruel. Servants noticed. Tutors noticed. His parents certainly noticed. The boy growing up beneath Woodstock's ancient roofs was beginning to resemble the leader everyone hoped he might become. Outside the palace, however, clouds were gathering over Europe. Political disputes sharpened. Diplomats exchanged increasingly tense letters. Claims to distant lands hardened into arguments. Arguments slowly transformed into preparations. Preparations have an unfortunate habit of becoming wars. England and France drifted steadily toward a conflict neither kingdom fully understood. It would eventually last more than a century. Generations would be born, fight, and die before it finally ended. The young prince could not yet comprehend that. He still measured time by seasons, by hunts, by lessons, by festivals. Yet history was already walking toward him, one careful step at a time. Soon, childhood would begin giving way to responsibility. The wooden practice sword would become real steel. The pony would become a mighty warhorse. The harmless games of chivalry would become battlefields where arrows fell like rain. But for one final moment, Edward remained simply a boy beneath the green canopies of Woodstock, unaware that Europe was quietly preparing to transform him into one of the most celebrated and controversial warriors of the Middle Ages. The peaceful years were drawing to a close, and the lessons of childhood were about to be tested by history itself. The young prince learns the art of kingship. There comes a quiet moment in every childhood when the world subtly changes. No trumpet announces it. No monk records it carefully in a leather-bound chronicle. One day, adults simply begin speaking to you differently. The conversations become more serious. The expectations grow heavier. People stop asking what games you enjoy and start wondering what kind of person you will become. For Edward of Woodstock, that moment arrived surprisingly early. By the early 1340s, the cheerful little boy racing through the forests around Woodstock Palace had stretched into a tall, broad-shouldered youth. His face had begun to lose the softness of childhood. His movements carried greater confidence. Servants who had once smiled indulgently at his curiosity now bowed with noticeably greater respect. The heir to England was growing up, and England needed him to grow up quickly. Because across the English Channel, politics had finally reached the point where polite letters no longer seemed sufficient. As history has repeatedly demonstrated, when kings begin writing increasingly formal correspondence to one another, someone usually ends up wearing armor. Edward III had spent years carefully strengthening his kingdom. He improved finances. He expanded England's navy. He encouraged trade. He rewarded loyal nobles. He reformed parts of the army. Unlike many medieval rulers who preferred solving every disagreement by charging dramatically toward it on horseback, Edward III understood that wars were often won long before the first sword left its scabbard. Preparation mattered. Ships had to be built. Food had to be stored. Roads repaired. Taxes collected. All rather dull work, admittedly. Yet kingdoms survive because someone keeps track of grain supplies, not because everyone gives inspiring speeches. Young Edward watched his father manage these responsibilities with remarkable discipline. The prince attended council meetings, not as an active participant at first, but as a careful observer. He stood quietly behind experienced nobles while discussions unfolded. Maps covered heavy oak tables. Wax seals cracked open, revealing messages from France. Messengers reported border disputes. Merchants requested new trading privileges. Bishops argued legal questions. Generals estimated troop numbers. No one explained everything to the prince. They didn't have to. Observation is often the finest teacher. Edward learned something essential. A king rarely enjoyed simple choices. Nearly every decision disappointed someone. Raise taxes? Merchants complained. Lower taxes? The treasury weakened. Declare war? Families lost fathers and sons. Avoid war? Neighbors might mistake restraint for weakness. Every crown came lined with invisible thorns. The people beneath it merely learned to hide the discomfort. His education expanded accordingly. The prince's tutors became increasingly demanding. Gone were the gentle childhood lessons. Now came philosophy, history, law, diplomacy, military strategy, religious ethics, financial administration. Latin texts by Roman writers filled his mornings. He studied Julius Caesar's campaigns. He read about Alexander the Great. He examined the triumphs and failures of ancient rulers. Because medieval Europe admired Rome almost as much as it misunderstood it, Roman history offered examples, sometimes warnings, sometimes both simultaneously. Edward particularly admired stories of commanders who led from the front. Cowardice disgusted medieval society, not merely fear itself. Everyone felt fear. Even the bravest knight occasionally glanced toward an approaching army and quietly reconsidered his career choices. Courage meant advancing anyway. That distinction mattered enormously. His instructors reinforced it constantly. A prince could not demand sacrifices from soldiers he himself refused to make. That lesson would remain with him for the rest of his life. Sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. Physical training also intensified. Edward's wooden practice weapons disappeared. Steel replaced them. The difference was immediate. Steel had weight, balance, danger. Mistakes hurt. A careless movement bruised wrists. Poor footwork resulted in spectacular tumbles before amused instructors. Every night accumulated embarrassing stories. The fortunate ones survived long enough to laugh about them later. Edward practiced daily. Sword against sword. Shield against axe. Mounted combat. Dismounted combat. Archery. Lance drills. Wrestling. Long hours riding increasingly spirited horses. Not every horse welcomed inexperienced riders. Some possessed opinions. Strong opinions. Occasionally those opinions involved depositing princes directly into muddy fields. One imagines the stable boys enjoyed those particular lessons immensely. Respectfully, of course. At least while the prince was watching. His favorite activity remained hunting. Not because it was easy. Quite the opposite. A successful hunt demanded concentration from dawn until sunset. Riders followed hounds through dense woodland. Falcons launched into cloudless skies. Stags vanished into forests with astonishing speed. The prince learned patience. Many hunts ended without success. Nature does not negotiate. No royal title persuaded a deer to stand still politely. Failure became another teacher. Every missed opportunity encouraged sharper observation next time. These experiences would later prove surprisingly valuable during military campaigns. Battlefields, after all, rewarded patience almost as much as courage. As Edward matured, tournaments became increasingly important. Modern audiences often imagine tournaments as colorful sporting events. In truth, they occupied a curious space somewhere between military training, social gathering, political theater, and controlled chaos. Imagine combining professional athletics, diplomatic conferences, armored boxing, and county fairs. You begin approaching the atmosphere. Color dominated everything. Bright banners fluttered above temporary arenas. Knights displayed family coats of arms painted brilliantly across shields. Musicians played while crowds cheered favorite competitors. Ladies watched from decorated platforms draped with embroidered fabrics. Merchants sold food. Children chased one another between tents. Blacksmiths repaired damaged armor. Priests blessed participants. Doctors quietly prepared for unpleasant emergencies. Everyone understood that tournaments remained dangerous. Wooden lances sometimes splintered harmlessly. Sometimes they didn't. Broken bones occurred frequently. Deaths happened occasionally. Entertainment carried certain occupational hazards. Edward excelled. Not immediately. Natural talent rarely eliminates hard work. But observers noticed his balance on horseback, his calm under pressure, his willingness to learn from experienced knights rather than merely relying upon noble birth. Respect, he discovered, had to be earned repeatedly. Every tournament offered another examination. Meanwhile, England itself buzzed with cautious optimism. Trade flourished. The navy expanded. Royal authority strengthened. Edward III surrounded himself with talented advisors and capable military commanders. Among them stood William Montague, the Earl of Salisbury, Henry of Gromont, Walter Manny, the Earl of Northampton. These men represented some of Europe's finest soldiers. Young Edward absorbed their conversations whenever possible. Veteran commanders possess a peculiar way of discussing warfare. Less romance, more logistics, less glory, more muddy roads. Where poets described heroic charges, experienced captains discussed food supplies. How many wagons? How many horses? How many arrows? History remembers battles. Generals remember whether bread arrived on time. Edward listened carefully. One evening, after supper, the prince walked along Woodstock's outer walls beside his father. The summer air remained pleasantly warm. Below them, servants carried lanterns across courtyards already fading into twilight. Owls had begun hunting. Somewhere beyond the palace grounds, wolves called faintly through distant forests. Edward III rested gloved hands upon the cold stone battlements. He gazed southward, toward France, toward possibilities, toward dangers. Neither father nor son spoke immediately. Silence sometimes carries greater meaning than conversation. Finally, the king said quietly, "A prince does not inherit peace." Edward glanced toward him. Edward III continued watching the horizon. He inherits whatever the previous generation leaves unfinished. Simple words. Profound truth. Every generation receives history half-written. No one begins with a blank page. The prince remembered that conversation for years afterward. In 1343, when Edward reached 13 years of age, preparations quietly accelerated. He would soon receive responsibilities normally reserved for grown men. Not symbolic responsibilities, real ones. The king appointed trusted advisors to guide him through administrative duties. Documents required his seal. Petitions reached his household. Nobles began addressing him less as a child and more as England's future ruler. The transition happened gradually, yet unmistakably. One morning, people smiled at him as a boy. Months later, they measured every word spoken in his presence. Power changes conversations. At the same time, Europe drifted steadily toward catastrophe. Edward III's claim to the French throne had hardened beyond negotiation. French King Philip VI rejected every English demand. Diplomacy exhausted itself. Merchants worried. Border lords strengthened castles. Shipbuilders worked endlessly. Archers practiced across English villages. The channel filled with warships. Everyone sensed something approaching, like thunder before a storm. No one knew precisely when lightning would strike, only that eventually, it would. The conflict, later called the 100 Years' War, had not yet fully revealed its terrible scale. Few imagined grandchildren would still be fighting battles begun by their grandfathers. History rarely advertises its duration. Wars almost always begin with optimistic predictions. They'll be home by Christmas. They'll surrender after one campaign. This shouldn't take long. History smiles gently whenever people make such promises. For Edward, however, another milestone arrived first. In 1343, he was created Prince of Wales, Earl of Chester, and Duke of Cornwall. The ceremony overflowed with symbolism. Magnificent robes, golden ornaments, ancient traditions. Trumpets echoed through great halls. Nobles knelt. Clergy offered blessings. The young prince accepted titles carrying enormous wealth and even greater responsibility. He was now officially England's first Duke of Cornwall, a title created specifically for the heir to the throne. Yet beneath the glitter lay something quieter. Expectation. No longer could anyone pretend he remained merely a promising youth. The kingdom now looked toward him openly. One day he would wear the crown. One day England's future would rest in his decisions. The weight settled invisibly upon his shoulders. He carried it with remarkable composure. Only a year later, the first great test arrived. Not in a classroom, not upon a tournament field, but upon the sea. England and France were finally moving toward open war. Ships gathered. Soldiers assembled. Armor was polished. Longbows were strung. The prince, still only a teenager, would accompany his father into one of the greatest military adventures of the Middle Ages. Soon he would hear thousands of marching feet. Soon he would smell campfires stretching across entire valleys. Soon he would discover that real warfare sounded nothing like heroic songs. Steel did not sing. It screamed. And boys who dreamed of glory often returned as men carrying memories far heavier than swords. The forests of Woodstock faded behind him. Childhood faded with them. Ahead lay Normandy. Ahead lay Crécy. Ahead waited the battlefield where a 16-year-old prince would astonish Europe and earn the first chapters of the legend that history would eventually remember as the Black Prince. Across the channel, the road to Crécy. The sea has a way of making every traveler feel small. Stand upon the deck of a 14th-century ship before dawn, and the world seems to dissolve into darkness and water. The shoreline fades into a gray silhouette. The wind tugs relentlessly at heavy wool cloaks. Salt spray settles over ropes, barrels, shields, and faces alike. The timbers beneath your feet groan with every passing wave, sounding almost as though the ship itself is muttering old complaints. Which, considering medieval shipbuilding, it very well might have been. Edward of Woodstock had crossed the English Channel before, but never like this. This was not a diplomatic journey, nor a royal procession. This was an invasion. Around him stretched one of the largest English fleets assembled in generations. Hundreds of vessels crowded the sea, great cogs with broad, rounded hulls, smaller transports packed with horses, supply ships loaded with grain, barrels of ale, salted meat, arrows, spare bowstrings, tents, tools, and enough equipment to support thousands of men for months. From a distance, the fleet resembled a floating forest. Hundreds of masts pierced the morning sky. Sails billowed in the wind like enormous white wings. Colorful banners snapped overhead, displaying the lions of England and the personal standards of powerful nobles. Somewhere below deck, horses stamped nervously. One could hardly blame them. Very few creatures enjoy sailing. Edward was 16 years old enough to carry armor, young enough that many modern parents would still hesitate to let him travel alone. The Middle Ages had rather different expectations. His father intended him to witness real war, not from a comfortable hill far behind the fighting, not safely tucked inside a castle. Edward III believed princes learned leadership by sharing danger with their soldiers. It was a harsh philosophy, but one that shaped medieval kingship. A ruler who expected others to bleed while remaining personally untouched rarely inspired lasting loyalty. The prince accepted this without complaint. Whether he felt fear, that is another matter entirely. Anyone who claims never to have feared battle has either never seen one, or is trying much too hard to impress someone. The fleet departed England in July of 1346. Weather favored them. For once. Even seasoned sailors offered thankful prayers. The English Channel possessed a reputation for unpredictable moods. Calm one hour, violent the next. Ships disappeared there every year. Storms cared remarkably little about noble blood. Kings floated no better than fishermen. Edward stood upon the deck watching England slowly disappear behind mist. The white cliffs faded into the distance until finally nothing remained except open water. Ahead lay France, a kingdom larger, richer, more populous, and entirely unprepared for what Edward III intended. The king's strategy surprised nearly everyone. Rather than striking directly toward Paris, the English landed in Normandy, one of France's wealthiest provinces. The landing itself unfolded with remarkable efficiency. Soldiers splashed ashore carrying bows, spears, shields, and supplies. Horses were carefully unloaded using ramps and slings. Engineers organized equipment. Archers immediately secured the beaches. Within hours, thousands of English troops stood upon French soil. For Edward, this marked the true beginning. No tournament, No exercise. No practice. Everything from this point forward carried genuine consequences. Normandy greeted them with green fields stretching toward distant villages. Apple orchards swayed gently in the summer breeze. Stone churches overlooked peaceful farms. Rivers wound lazily through fertile countryside. It appeared tranquil. Beautiful even. Until the army arrived. Medieval warfare often followed a strategy known as the chevauchée. The word sounds elegant. Its reality was considerably less so. Rather than immediately seeking one decisive battle, armies rode across enemy territory destroying crops, burning villages, capturing supplies, and demonstrating that the defending king could not protect his own people. It was economic warfare, psychological warfare, political warfare, all wrapped together beneath clouds of smoke. Edward witnessed villages abandoned in haste. Families fled carrying whatever possessions they could lift. Livestock wandered unattended through empty fields. Church bells rang desperately as frightened communities searched for refuge behind city walls. Not every settlement resisted. Many simply prayed the army would pass quickly. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. The prince observed all of it. War no longer resembled the shining stories told beside palace fireplaces. It smelled of smoke, wet earth, sweating horses, exhaustion. The English army advanced steadily. Discipline remained surprisingly strict. Edward III understood that an army descending into chaos quickly endangered itself. Scouts rode ahead. Engineers repaired bridges. Quartermasters distributed food. Blacksmiths shod horses almost continuously. Thousands of ordinary tasks filled every day. History often remembers battles. Yet armies spend far more time marching than fighting. Marching. Waiting. Building camps. Marching again. Edward quickly learned this rhythm. Each evening, tents spread across fields in astonishing numbers. Campfires flickered beneath darkening skies. Soldiers cooked whatever meals circumstances permitted, usually bread, salted meat, ale, perhaps onions. If fortune smiled. The prince walked among these camps. He spoke with experienced knights. He watched longbowmen repairing feathers upon arrows. He listened to veterans sharing stories whose endings grew more dramatic with every retelling. Military camps create peculiar communities. Tomorrow many men may die. Tonight they laugh together. Human beings possess an extraordinary ability to find normality even in extraordinary circumstances. One afternoon, Edward encountered a group of Welsh longbowmen practicing beyond the main encampment. Their bows appeared astonishingly tall, nearly as tall as the men themselves. Drawing such weapons demanded immense strength, not merely technique. Years of physical conditioning shaped bodies capable of using the English longbow effectively. The archers fired together. The sound resembled cloth tearing. Dozens of arrows vanished into the sky. Moments later they struck distant targets almost simultaneously. Thump, 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 thump. The prince watched silently. An older archer noticed him. He smiled respectfully. "Looks easy enough, doesn't it, my lord?" Edward smiled in return. The man handed him the bow. The prince attempted to draw it fully. He managed. Almost. The archer nodded politely. Nearly. No embarrassment followed. Only quiet respect. The prince understood something important. These common soldiers possessed skills beyond those of many nobles. England's strength rested not solely upon armored knights. It rested equally upon thousands of disciplined archers whose names history would rarely preserve. Edward never forgot that lesson. The campaign reached Rouen outskirts but bypassed the strongly defended city. Instead, Edward III continued ravaging Normandy. French commanders struggled to predict his movements. King Philip VI gathered an enormous army, larger than England's, perhaps much larger. The English, meanwhile, marched steadily northward. The tension grew daily. Scouts reported increasing French activity. Villagers whispered rumors. Roads filled with refugees. The enemy was coming. Everyone knew it. No one knew precisely when. During one particularly warm evening, father and son rode together beyond the main column. The countryside glowed beneath the setting sun. Golden light washed across wheat fields not yet harvested. A shepherd hurried his flock toward distant safety. Neither rider spoke for several minutes. Eventually, Edward broke the silence. Will they fight us soon? His father considered the question carefully. They'll try to choose the ground. And if we choose first? The king smiled slightly. Then perhaps they'll regret arriving. Edward looked across the landscape. So much depends on where men stand. Edward III nodded. So much. Simple words. Yet every great general understood their truth. Battles were often decided before swords crossed. Hills mattered. Forests mattered. Streams mattered. Mud mattered. Ground itself could become an ally, or an enemy. By August, the English army found itself pursued relentlessly. Philip VI advanced with overwhelming numbers. The French intended to trap Edward III before he could escape toward friendly territory. The situation grew dangerous. Supplies dwindled. Soldiers marched longer hours. Crossing rivers became urgent. Every delay increased the risk of encirclement. The English reached the River Somme. French forces blocked many crossings. For several anxious days, the army searched desperately for a ford. Failure meant disaster. Imagine thousands of exhausted soldiers trapped between a powerful enemy and an uncrossable river. Even experienced veterans grew uneasy. The prince surely sensed the strain spreading through the army. Then fortune intervened, or perhaps careful reconnaissance, depending upon whether one prefers miracles or military planning. Local guides revealed a tidal crossing known as Blanche Attack. Timing proved essential. Too early. Water remained too deep. Too late. The French arrived first. The English crossed under enemy pressure. Archers covered the ford while knights fought fiercely in waist-deep water. Eventually, the army reached the opposite bank. Safe. Temporarily. Relief swept through the ranks. The worst danger had passed. Another now approached. Edward III finally selected ground near the tiny village of Crécy and Poitiers. Rolling hills overlooked open farmland. Small woods protected the flanks. The position favored defense. Exactly as the king intended. The army halted. Soldiers dug shallow defensive positions. Archers prepared bundles of arrows. Armor received final adjustments. Priests moved quietly among the men, offering prayers and hearing confessions. Campfires burned lower than usual that evening. Conversation softened. Everyone understood. Tomorrow, or perhaps the next day, they would fight. Not a raid. Not a skirmish. A battle. One that might determine the fate of kingdoms. Edward spent that final evening walking through the English camp. He noticed familiar faces. Knights who had trained beside him. Archers he had watched practicing weeks earlier. Young squires nervously checking straps again and again. Older veterans sleeping peacefully despite tomorrow's uncertainty. Experience teaches acceptance. Fear exhausts itself eventually. One old soldier sat sharpening his sword. Edward paused beside him. Will that make much difference? The veteran glanced upward. Probably not. He continued sharpening. But it gives the hand something useful to do. The prince smiled. Perhaps he understood. Sometimes preparation calms the mind even when it cannot change the outcome. Night settled across Crécy. Stars emerged one by one above the silent countryside. Somewhere beyond the darkness lay the French army. Larger. Confident. Advancing steadily. The English waited. Owls hunted through nearby woods. Horses shifted restlessly in their lines. The breeze carried faint scents of cut wheat and distant rain. Edward removed his helmet and looked upward. The same stars he had watched as a child above Woodstock now shone over foreign fields. Tomorrow those peaceful lights would witness one of the most famous battles in medieval history. Tomorrow a 16-year-old prince would command soldiers in real combat for the very first time. Tomorrow legends would begin, though no one standing beneath those stars could possibly know it. For now there was only silence, only waiting. Only the slow breathing of thousands of men trying to sleep before dawn, because morning was coming. And with it, Crécy. The Battle of Crécy, A prince earns his legend. Dawn arrived over the fields of Crécy with an almost unsettling gentleness. The first light crept across the rolling countryside, touching dew-covered grass until the entire landscape shimmered silver. A cool breeze wandered through the wheat fields, bending each stalk in slow waves that looked almost like the sea. Birds sang. A hare darted across the edge of a meadow. Somewhere a church bell rang faintly from a village whose people had wisely disappeared long before the armies arrived. If someone had wandered into the valley at that moment, they might have believed it was simply another peaceful August morning. History often chooses remarkably beautiful places for terrible events. The English camp stirred before sunrise. No shouting. No panic. Only practiced routine. Armor buckles tightened. Helmet straps fastened. Bowstrings inspected one final time. Horses fed lightly. Priests moved quietly through the ranks, blessing soldiers who knelt in the damp grass. Many confessed their sins, not because they suddenly became unusually pious, but because battle has a remarkable way of reminding people that tomorrow is never guaranteed. Edward of Woodstock knelt beside hundreds of other men. Despite his royal birth, he prayed no differently than the common archer beside him. His armor, though beautifully crafted, could not stop every arrow. His title offered little protection against a sword. Death, medieval people often observed, possessed excellent manners. It treated everyone equally. The prince rose and looked across the battlefield. King Edward III had arranged the army carefully. Nothing had been left to chance. The English occupied the crest of a gentle slope. It was not an enormous hill, merely high enough to force attackers uphill while exposing them to arrow fire. Sometimes greatness depends upon choosing slightly better ground than the other fellow. The army stood divided into three main formations. The king commanded the reserve. The Earl of Northampton held one division. The 16-year-old Prince Edward, still years away from becoming the feared Black Prince, commanded the forward division. Imagine receiving your first major military command before reaching adulthood. Some modern teenagers worry about passing driving tests. Edward worried about surviving one of medieval Europe's largest battles. Perspective is everything. His commanders surrounded him. Experienced men. Veterans who had fought campaigns before the prince had learned to shave. Among them stood Sir John Chandos, one of England's finest knights. Calm. Disciplined. Highly respected. Chandos would become one of Edward's closest companions throughout his military career. The older knight studied the prince quietly. "You slept?" Edward smiled faintly. "A little." Chandos nodded. So did everyone else. It was probably untrue, but kindness occasionally disguises itself as reassurance. Across the valley, dust clouds appeared upon the horizon. The French were arriving. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers stretched across roads and fields. Bright banners fluttered above armored knights. Crossbowmen marched beneath the flags of Genoa. Heavy cavalry assembled in glittering ranks. Servants hurried between noble lords. Trumpets echoed through the morning air. The French army looked magnificent. Magnificent. And increasingly disorganized. King Philip VI had marched his army hard to catch the English before they escaped. Many units had traveled long distances under exhausting conditions. Some soldiers arrived hungry, others thirsty. Many simply tired. Not ideal circumstances before fighting. Yet enthusiasm often overwhelms common sense, especially among medieval nobles eager for glory. From the English lines, the prince watched wave after wave of French troops continue arriving. Their numbers seemed endless. Contemporary chroniclers exaggerated medieval army sizes with remarkable enthusiasm, but there is little doubt the French significantly outnumbered the English. Edward understood the mathematics. More enemies. Fewer friends. Simple arithmetic. Uncomfortable arithmetic. Yet his father's strategy depended precisely upon overcoming numbers through discipline. The English would remain still. The French probably wouldn't. By late afternoon, tension filled the air almost as heavily as the humidity. Dark clouds gathered overhead. The wind shifted. Then suddenly, rain. Heavy rain. It swept across the battlefield in sheets, soaking clothing, banners, horses, and men alike. Archers hurried to protect their bowstrings beneath caps and cloaks. English longbow strings were easily removed and kept dry. The Genoese crossbowmen serving France possessed no such advantage. Their crossbows became damp. Their strings stretched. Power diminished. A small detail. One that would soon prove devastating. History occasionally hinges upon remarkably ordinary inconveniences. The rain stopped as quickly as it had begun. Sunlight returned. Steam rose gently from wet fields. The French commanders decided to attack. Immediately. Despite the exhaustion of many troops. Despite the confusion still unfolding behind the front lines. Despite advice urging caution. Because medieval nobles occasionally believed momentum solved every problem. As if determination alone could persuade physics to cooperate. The Genoese crossbowmen advanced first. Thousands of professional mercenaries moved steadily toward the English position. They raised their weapons, loaded bolts, prepared carefully, then fired. The volley reached the English line, weakly. Many bolts fell short. Others lacked their usual penetrating power. The soaked crossbows had betrayed them. A heartbeat later, the English longbows answered. The sound became legendary. Not loud individually. Thousands together produced something altogether different. A deep, ripping hiss, like an enormous flock of invisible birds taking flight. Then came the impact. Arrows descended in terrifying numbers. The Genoese staggered. Men fell. Others struggled desperately to reload. Again the English fired. Again. 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 A skilled longbowman could loose perhaps 10 or 12 arrows in the time required for one crossbowman to reload. The difference became catastrophic. Within minutes, the Genoese line collapsed. They turned. Retreated. Attempted to escape. The French knights behind them reacted with disbelief. Then anger. According to several chroniclers, some French nobles interpreted the retreat as cowardice. Rather than allowing the crossbowmen to withdraw, they charged directly through them. Imagine surviving a storm of arrows only to be ridden down by your own allies. Battlefield confusion rarely resembles the orderly maps found in history books. It is noisy, chaotic, filled with misunderstandings. Crécy proved no exception. Then came the cavalry. Wave after wave of heavily armored French knights thundered uphill. Their banners streamed behind them. Warhorses pounded the earth. Lances lowered. Voices shouting. Trumpets blaring. From a distance it must have appeared unstoppable. The flower of French chivalry. Hundreds of mounted nobles charging together. A magnificent spectacle. Straight into carefully prepared English defenses. Edward watched the charge approaching. Every instinct must have urged action. Every heartbeat quicker than the last. Around him the English line remained astonishingly calm. Archers continued shooting methodically. Not wildly. Not desperately. Methodically. Thousands of arrows darkened the afternoon sky. Horses screamed. Men fell. Armor deflected many arrows. Horses possessed far less protection. Wounded animals crashed into one another. Riders tumbled beneath following cavalry. The slope itself slowed momentum. Mud from the earlier rain made footing uncertain. Order dissolved. The charge became a crowded struggle. Exactly as Edward III intended. Now came the hardest fighting. French knights reached the English line. Steel met steel. Axes crashed against shields. Swords rang across helmets. The prince fought among his men, not behind them. Not watching safely from a distant hill. Contemporary chroniclers repeatedly praised his courage that day. He rode where danger proved greatest. He encouraged soldiers personally. He led, rather than merely commanded. That distinction mattered enormously. Yet bravery sometimes carries consequences. At one point, the fighting around Edward grew dangerously intense. French knights pressed forward relentlessly. Several English standards fell. Confusion spread through the prince's division. Messengers galloped uphill toward King Edward III. They carried alarming news. The prince might be overwhelmed. One advisor urged the king to send immediate reinforcements. The moment became famous. Edward III reportedly asked a simple question: "Is my son dead?" "No, sire." "Is he wounded?" "No, sire." The king paused, then answered, "No help shall be sent while he lives." It sounds astonishingly harsh, almost cold. Yet Edward III explained further. He wished his son to earn his honor. If the prince could hold the field himself, the glory would belong entirely to him. Modern parents may find this educational philosophy somewhat questionable. Character building has evolved considerably over the centuries. Nevertheless, the decision remained. The reserve stayed where it was. The young prince would stand alone, or fall alone. Edward never learned of this conversation until later. He simply continued fighting. Hour after exhausting hour, his commanders rallied soldiers. Longbowmen shifted positions. Knights counterattacked where necessary. The English line bent, but never broke. French assaults continued. Again. 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 Each attack met disciplined resistance. Each failed. The battlefield slowly filled with abandoned banners, broken weapons, riderless horses, and the fallen from both kingdoms. The afternoon stretched into evening. Still the French attacked. Still they failed. As the sun began sinking toward the horizon, the outcome became undeniable. France had lost. Not because its soldiers lacked courage. Few questioned their bravery. They had charged repeatedly into extraordinary danger. Rather, courage alone could not overcome poor coordination, exhausted troops, unfavorable terrain, and England's devastating longbow tactics. Military history often reminds us of an uncomfortable truth. Valor without strategy rarely succeeds. Among the dead lay many of France's greatest nobles. Most famous of all was John of Bohemia. The aging blind king had insisted upon joining the battle despite having completely lost his sight. According to tradition, he asked his companions to tie their horses together so he might ride into combat one final time. Whether every detail is true remains uncertain. The image endured because it captured medieval ideals perfectly. Honor above life itself. The king died where he wished, sword in hand. Edward later adopted John of Bohemia's ostrich feathers and the motto, Ich diene, I serve, symbols still associated with the Prince of Wales today. A tribute from victor to fallen enemy, even amid war. Respect sometimes survived. Darkness settled slowly over Crécy. The fighting ceased. Groans replaced battle cries. Campfires flickered once more across the hills. Survivors searched for friends. Physicians worked without rest. Priests whispered final prayers. Rainwater collected silently in abandoned helmets scattered across the field. The prince removed his own helmet. His face streaked with sweat, dust, perhaps blood. Whether his own or someone else's hardly mattered now. He had survived. More than that, he had led. Word spread rapidly through the English camp. The prince had held his ground. The prince had fought bravely. The prince had proven worthy of command. His father embraced him after the battle. According to tradition, the king declared that his son had won his spurs that day. Whether those exact words were spoken we cannot know, but their meaning echoed across Europe. The boy who had crossed the Channel weeks earlier had disappeared forever. In his place stood a commander, not yet the Black Prince. That famous name would come later. But the legend had begun, and Europe had taken notice. Calais, the long siege that changed England forever. The morning after the Battle of Crécy did not feel victorious. Not at first. Victory, contrary to the paintings hanging in grand museums, rarely arrives accompanied by shining sunlight and triumphant music. Instead, it begins with silence. A strange, heavy silence. The kind that settles over a battlefield after thousands of voices have disappeared. Mist drifted across the fields of Crécy, curling around broken wagons, shattered lances, abandoned shields, and horses that would never carry another rider. Ravens circled overhead with patient confidence. They had witnessed human wars for centuries and understood that armies always left something behind. The air smelled of damp earth, extinguished campfires, and iron. So much iron. For Edward of Woodstock, now 16 years old, this morning marked another lesson no tutor had ever been able to teach. Victory had a cost. The prince rode slowly across parts of the battlefield alongside several senior knights. Yesterday, these fields had thundered beneath charging cavalry. Today, they were almost peaceful. Almost. Occasionally, a wounded soldier called weakly for water. Priests moved quietly between the fallen, offering final prayers regardless of nationality. English physicians treated French nobles when possible. French clergy prayed for English dead. War created enemies. Death often erased those distinctions. Edward removed his helmet as they passed a group of fallen French knights. One of his companions noticed, "My lord." The prince looked toward the silent figures lying beneath torn banners. They were brave. The knight nodded. They were. No celebration followed. Only respect. It would become one of Edward's defining characteristics. He admired courage, even when it belonged to his enemies. Crécy echoed throughout Europe. Messengers raced across kingdoms carrying astonishing news. The French army had been defeated, not merely pushed back. Defeated decisively. Kings read reports in disbelief. Merchants discussed the battle in crowded marketplaces. Monks carefully copied accounts into chronicles. Traveling minstrels quickly began composing songs, adding a few dramatic embellishments because, naturally, they did. Before long, Edward's name accompanied every telling. The young prince had commanded troops under immense pressure. He had stood his ground. He had refused to flee. In an age that valued courage above almost everything else, stories like these spread remarkably fast. Legend travels much faster than an army. Yet Edward III understood something crucial. Battles win opportunities. They do not necessarily win wars. France remained enormous. Its king still ruled. Its castles still stood. Its armies could recover. The English needed something more permanent. A foothold. A gateway. A port that would allow future campaigns across the channel. The answer stood on the northern coast. Calais. Imagine approaching Calais in the 14th century. The city rose beside the sea, protected by thick stone walls reinforced with powerful towers. Marshes surrounded much of the approach, creating natural defenses almost as effective as the walls themselves. Beyond the fortifications stretched the harbor. This was the true prize. Calais connected England with continental Europe. Merchants sailed constantly between its docks and ports across the North Sea. Control Calais, and England possessed a secure doorway into France. Lose it, and every future invasion became far more difficult. Edward III intended to keep it. The English army arrived before Calais in September of 1346. Many soldiers expected another assault, perhaps ladders against the walls, battering rams, siege towers, something dramatic. Instead, the king chose patience, which disappointed anyone hoping for immediate excitement, but delighted military historians 7 centuries later. Rather than storming the city, Edward decided to starve it. Calais would simply be surrounded. Nothing would enter. Nothing would leave. Eventually, food would disappear. Then hope. Finally, surrender. It sounds straightforward. In reality, it required extraordinary organization. A siege is a peculiar kind of war. Battles unfold over hours. Sieges unfold over seasons, sometimes years. Instead of constant fighting, life settles into routine. Build fortifications. Stand guard. Repair equipment. Cook meals. Wait. Repeat. Edward discovered that patience could be just as demanding as courage. The English constructed an entire wooden town outside Calais. It became known as Villeneuve-la-Hardy, Newtown the Bold. Imagine an entire temporary city rising almost overnight. Rows of wooden houses, workshops, stables, smithies, warehouses, chapels, bakeries, even small marketplaces. Thousands of people lived there. Soldiers, craftsmen, merchants, families, priests, doctors, blacksmiths, carpenters, fishermen. A siege army became a functioning community. Children were even born there. History has an odd habit of continuing ordinary life in extraordinary places. Edward of Woodstock embraced this new rhythm. Unlike the desperate energy of Crécy, Calais demanded discipline measured in months rather than moments. The prince inspected defenses daily. He visited workshops where armorers repaired dented helmets. He watched blacksmiths shoe horses until sparks filled the twilight. He spoke with longbowmen practicing beyond the camp. Even during a siege, training never stopped. An army that grows lazy grows vulnerable. Life inside Calais, however, grew steadily worse. At first, the citizens remained confident. Their walls were strong. The French king would surely rescue them. Surely. Weeks passed. Then months. Food became scarce. Bread grew smaller. Meat disappeared almost entirely. Horses were slaughtered. Dogs vanished. Cats soon followed. One imagines the local mice experienced several unusually optimistic weeks before realizing the overall situation remained rather grim. Hunger changes everything. Proud people become desperate. Ordinary disagreements become fierce arguments. Hope itself begins shrinking. Edward occasionally rode close enough to the city walls to observe the defenders. Archers stared back from towers. Sometimes insults crossed the distance. Sometimes arrows. Sometimes simply silence. The prince wondered what life looked like inside those walls. Did children still play games? Did families still gather around tiny fires? Did church bells continue ringing every morning? War often encourages us to imagine enemies as entirely different from ourselves. Edward increasingly suspected otherwise. Behind every wall lived people trying to survive. The French attempted several relief efforts. Supplies arrived secretly by sea when weather permitted. Small boats slipped through undercover of darkness. Some succeeded. Many did not. The English Navy tightened its blockade relentlessly. No grain. No reinforcements. No escape. The noose slowly tightened. Edward III understood that time now fought on England's side. Every sunrise weakened Calais more than any catapult could. Winter arrived. The siege continued. Cold winds swept in from the north, sea carrying freezing rain. Mud swallowed boots. Campfires became precious. Tents leaked. Clothing never quite dried. The prince shared these hardships. He slept in camp. He rode inspections regardless of weather. He endured the same freezing winds blowing off the sea. Leadership demanded visibility. If soldiers suffered, their prince suffered beside them. Morale depends upon such things. People willingly endure hardship when they believe it is shared fairly. One evening, Edward sat beside Sir John Chandos, watching waves crash against the dark shoreline. The sea reflected scattered moonlight. Ships anchored offshore rocked gently in the tide. Neither man spoke for some time. Finally, the prince broke the silence. I thought victory would feel different. Chandos glanced toward him. Different how? Edward considered the question. Louder. The older knight smiled faintly. It usually isn't. Another silence. Then Chandos added quietly. Most victories are mostly waiting. The prince laughed softly. I don't think the poets mention that. No. They should. They'd sell fewer songs. As winter yielded reluctantly to spring, conditions inside Calais became catastrophic. The governor, Jean de Vienne, faced impossible choices. Too many mouths. Too little food. Eventually, he expelled hundreds of the city's poorest inhabitants, elderly people, women, children, laborers, hoping they might pass through English lines. Instead, they became trapped. The English refused entry. The French could not take them back. For days they remained between the walls and the besieging army, neither side able or willing to solve the tragedy. Accounts differ regarding exactly how events unfolded. Some chroniclers describe terrible suffering before Edward III eventually permitted many civilians to pass. Others disagree over timing. What remains beyond doubt is this: war always falls hardest upon those who never chose it. The prince witnessed these scenes. The memory likely remained with him long afterward. History remembers kings, but ordinary faces often linger longest in human memory. By July of 1347, nearly a full year after Crécy, Calais could endure no longer. Food had vanished. Disease spread. Hope faded. Jean de Vienne requested terms. Edward III demanded unconditional surrender. Negotiations followed. Eventually, an agreement emerged. The city would yield. But first, 6 leading citizens would present themselves barefoot, wearing simple shirts, ropes around their necks, carrying the keys to Calais. They expected death. The scene became one of medieval Europe's most famous moments. At dawn, the gates opened slowly. 6 men walked forward. Among them stood Eustache de Saint-Pierre, an elderly merchant chosen to lead the delegation. Their faces revealed exhaustion more than fear. They had volunteered to save their city. The English camp fell unusually quiet as they approached. Even hardened soldiers understood courage when they saw it. Edward watched beside his father. King Edward III accepted the keys. According to many accounts, he initially intended to execute the men. Years of costly warfare had hardened him. Then Queen Philippa intervened. Pregnant at the time, she knelt before her husband and pleaded for mercy. She reminded him that sparing brave men often brings greater honor than killing them. The king relented. The 6 citizens lived. Sometimes the greatest victories belong not to swords, but to compassion. Edward never forgot the scene. A queen's mercy had accomplished what armies could not. Calais became England's greatest continental possession. For more than 2 centuries, it remained an English stronghold. Merchants prospered. Armies crossed safely. Trade flourished. The victory reshaped the balance of power between England and France. For the young prince, however, something more personal had changed. He had crossed the Channel as an eager teenager. Now he returned as one of Europe's most admired young commanders. He had survived battle, endured a year-long siege, learned patience, learned restraint, learned that leadership required more than courage. Europe had begun watching him carefully. Some admired him. Others feared him. Many wondered what this remarkable prince might accomplish next. They would not have to wait long. Because while England celebrated Crécy and Calais, across Europe, a far darker enemy had already begun its silent march. An enemy no army could defeat. No castle could resist. No prince could command. And before Edward's greatest triumphs still lay ahead, the world itself was about to change forever. The Black Death and the rise of a legendary prince. The ships arrived quietly. No trumpets announced them. No watchman standing atop a lonely lighthouse raised an alarm. They appeared one by one upon the horizon, their sails swelling in the Mediterranean wind just as countless merchant vessels had done for centuries. They carried spices, silk, wine, wool, letters from distant kingdoms, hopeful merchants dreaming of profit, and something else. Something no one could see. No one could bargain with. No one even understood. Hidden among sacks of grain, bundles of cloth, and the wooden beams of crowded ships traveled fleas. Those fleas fed upon black rats. The rats carried a tiny bacterium that would soon alter the course of European history more profoundly than any king or conqueror. The Black Death was coming. And unlike invading armies, it did not care whose banner flew above the castle walls. Edward of Woodstock first heard scattered rumors while still enjoying the triumph that followed the capture of Calais. Travelers arriving from Italy spoke in uncertain voices. Entire towns falling strangely silent. Ships drifting into harbors with almost no living crew. Families disappearing within days. Monasteries struggling to bury the dead. At first, these stories sounded exaggerated. The Middle Ages loved dramatic rumors. Every few months someone claimed to have spotted sea monsters, dragons, miraculous relics, or kingdoms made entirely of gold. People listened politely, then returned to work. This sounded similar. Surely. Except, the reports never stopped. Instead, they grew worse. By 1348, the plague reached England. It arrived by sea, slipping through busy ports where merchants unloaded cargo with ordinary confidence. Bristol suffered terribly. Soon London followed. The disease spread with terrifying speed. Modern medicine explains much of what happened. Medieval people could not. To them, the plague felt almost supernatural. Healthy neighbors became feverish overnight. Painful swellings, called buboes, appeared beneath the arms, around the neck, and in the groin. Victims developed high fevers. Some coughed blood. Many died within days. Physicians prescribed herbs, prayers, bloodletting, perfumed flowers, strange mixtures of vinegar and spices. Some blamed poisoned air. Others believed the planets had aligned disastrously. Many simply fell to their knees and begged God for mercy. Nothing seemed to stop it. Imagine London in the autumn of 1348. Markets that once echoed with shouting merchants now stood eerily quiet. Church bells rang almost constantly. Not for weddings. Not for festivals. For funerals. Again. And again. And again. The sound became so familiar that many people stopped counting. Gravediggers worked until exhaustion overtook them. Priests hurried from house to house offering final prayers. Doctors, powerless to cure the illness, sometimes fled. Others remained. Many died beside the patients they tried to help. No one knew who might fall ill next. Not kings. Not beggars. Not children. Not bishops. Death had become astonishingly democratic. Edward watched England transform almost beyond recognition. The roads emptied. Travel slowed. Trade nearly stopped. Entire villages vanished from official records because there was no one left alive to pay taxes. Fields lay abandoned. Crops rotted where they stood. Sheep wandered without shepherds. Nature quietly reclaimed places humans had occupied for generations. The prince rode through parts of the countryside where silence felt almost unnatural. A farmhouse. No smoke. A church. Its door hanging open. An orchard. Apples falling untouched into long grass. It was as though the land itself had paused to mourn. The royal family, like many wealthy households, moved frequently in hopes of avoiding infection. They traveled from palace to palace, seeking cleaner air and less crowded surroundings. Whether it truly helped remains uncertain. Disease ignored social rank with remarkable consistency. Even the greatest castle could not keep out invisible enemies. Edward's mother, Queen Philippa, organized charitable efforts wherever possible. Food was distributed. Alms increased. Churches received support. She believed that kindness mattered most when hope seemed scarce. The prince watched her closely. Years later, he would remember those lessons. Greatness, he was beginning to understand, required more than military brilliance. The plague reshaped England in unexpected ways. So many laborers died that surviving workers suddenly found themselves far more valuable. Landowners struggled to harvest crops. Builders lacked craftsmen. Blacksmiths became scarce. Even simple farm work commanded higher wages. For centuries, society had rested upon rigid hierarchies. Now those hierarchies trembled. The survivors realized something extraordinary. They had choices. Imagine spending generations believing your future had already been decided, then discovering history had unexpectedly rewritten the rules. Kings noticed. Nobles noticed. Everyone noticed. The economy itself began changing. Not overnight, but unmistakably. Edward discussed these changes with his father during long evenings inside Windsor Castle. The great fortress overlooked the Thames, its thick walls offering security but little comfort against the unsettling news arriving almost daily. One evening, while studying reports from across the kingdom, Edward III sighed heavily. It seems impossible. The prince looked up from a parchment. What does? Winning battles against France. The king tapped another report. While losing subjects to something no sword can reach. Edward remained silent. His father continued quietly. I know how to prepare for war. Another pause. I don't know how to prepare for this. Perhaps that was the hardest truth of all. Even powerful kings eventually encounter problems beyond their control. Not everyone responded to the plague with compassion. Fear has always possessed an unfortunate talent for seeking someone to blame. Rumors spread rapidly. Foreigners. Travelers. Minority communities. Anyone who seemed different risked suspicion. Across parts of Europe, terrible violence erupted against innocent people falsely accused of causing the disease. England experienced less of this than some continental regions, but fear nevertheless darkened countless hearts. Edward observed both the best and worst of humanity during these years. Some people abandoned neighbors. Others risked everything to care for strangers. History rarely divides neatly into heroes and villains. More often, ordinary people reveal unexpected courage or unexpected selfishness, sometimes both. The prince himself escaped the plague. Many around him did not. Servants disappeared. Soldiers failed to answer roll call. Familiar faces quietly vanished from court. No dramatic farewell. Simply gone. Death became part of everyday conversation, not because people grew comfortable with it, because they had no choice. Imagine attending so many funerals that mourning itself became routine. The emotional weight proved almost impossible to describe, even today. Yet life, stubbornly, continued. Children were still born. Harvests still needed gathering. Courts still settled disputes. Merchants slowly returned to markets. Ships sailed once more. The church rang bells not only for funerals, but eventually for weddings again. Human beings possess remarkable resilience. Given enough time, they begin rebuilding almost anything, even hope. Edward noticed this quiet recovery. It fascinated him. The same people who had buried loved ones only months earlier now repaired fences, planted wheat, mended roofs, laughed occasionally. Not because they had forgotten, but because living itself became an act of defiance. As Europe slowly emerged from the first terrible wave of plague, the young prince found himself entering adulthood. He was no longer merely the promising commander from Crécy. He had become one of England's central figures. Foreign ambassadors studied him carefully. Chroniclers praised his discipline. Young knights admired him. Older commanders increasingly trusted him. His reputation spread across Europe almost as quickly as stories of his victories. There was something compelling about Edward. He combined youthful confidence with genuine humility, at least for now. Fame changes people, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly. The prince had not yet reached that crossroads. During these years, Edward devoted increasing attention to the ideals of chivalry, not simply fighting well, living honorably. He admired courage, generosity, loyalty, courtesy. These virtues formed the foundation of medieval knighthood. Reality often fell short. Many knights proved greedy, cruel, dishonest. Human beings rarely achieve their own ideals consistently, yet Edward genuinely believed such principles mattered. Perhaps because he had witnessed how quickly life could disappear. The plague had stripped away illusions. Titles offered no immunity. Gold purchased no extra years. Only reputation endured. If one wished to leave something lasting behind, honor seemed a reasonable place to begin. He became increasingly involved in tournaments once again. The great contests returned as Europe slowly recovered. Fields outside castles filled with colorful tents. Trumpets echoed. Ladies watched from decorated stands. Knights tested themselves before enthusiastic crowds. Edward excelled, not merely because of strength, but because he understood discipline. He treated tournaments as preparation rather than entertainment. Every pass with the lance, every sword strike, every maneuver on horseback, each refined skills that might one day save lives, his own included. Visitors to the English court often remarked upon the prince's appearance. He was tall, athletic, fair-haired, confident without appearing arrogant. Contemporary chroniclers repeatedly praised both his physical presence and his manners. He possessed what medieval society admired most: grace under pressure. Whether greeting ambassadors, leading soldiers, or competing in tournaments, Edward seemed remarkably composed. Appearances matter greatly in politics, perhaps more than they should. Kings and princes constantly perform leadership. Edward learned the role exceptionally well. By the early 1350s, England had largely survived the first great wave of the plague. Scarred, changed forever, but alive. France, meanwhile, struggled with its own recovery. The long war had paused briefly, though everyone understood peace remained fragile. Treaties came and went. Negotiations drifted endlessly. Both kingdoms rebuilt armies. Both watched one another carefully. Everyone sensed that another campaign was only a matter of time. Edward sensed it too. He welcomed the challenge. Youth often mistakes confidence for certainty. The prince believed himself ready. In many ways, he was. What he could not know was that his greatest triumph still lay ahead. Soon he would ride once more into France. Soon he would command an army across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Soon he would fight the battle that would astonish medieval Europe even more than Crécy. And this time, his opponent would not merely be an army. It would be the king of France himself. The road to Poitiers was beginning. And somewhere along that road, Edward of Woodstock would finally begin earning the name history would remember forever. The Black Prince. The road to Poitiers. A prince becomes a legend. The years after the plague felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful. Simply quieter. Europe breathed again after holding its breath for far too long. Fields once abandoned slowly turned green beneath fresh crops. Merchants reopened their shops. Pilgrims once again appeared on dusty roads leading toward distant shrines. Bells rang for weddings more often than funerals. Children who had never known the world before the plague filled village streets with laughter that sounded almost miraculous. Life, stubborn as an oak tree growing from broken ground, refused to disappear. Yet beneath that fragile calm, the war between England and France remained unfinished. Neither kingdom had forgotten Crécy. Neither kingdom intended to surrender its claims. The conflict merely slept. And sleeping wars have an unfortunate habit of waking. Edward of Woodstock was now in his mid-20s. The uncertain teenager who had crossed the English Channel with wide eyes had become something entirely different. His shoulders had broadened. His voice carried quiet authority. His reputation stretched from Scotland to Italy. Every noble court in Europe knew his name. Some admired him. Others feared him. Many envied him. That, history suggests, is usually how you know you've become important. No matter what century you happen to inhabit. The prince had also become one of the finest horsemen in Europe. Contemporary chroniclers repeatedly praised his ability in the saddle. A medieval knight and his horse formed something closer to a partnership than simple ownership. War horses, known as destriers, were astonishingly valuable, powerful, highly trained, intelligent enough to recognize battle, strong enough to carry heavily armored riders across rough ground. Imagine trusting another living creature with your survival every single day. Edward spent countless hours riding, not only during campaigns, every season, every year. Rain, snow, summer heat. Discipline rarely takes holidays. His military household expanded as his influence grew. Among the men surrounding him stood some of England's greatest captains. Sir John Chandos remained his closest advisor. Calm where others became excited. Thoughtful where others rushed. If Edward represented courage, Chandos often represented wisdom. Every remarkable leader benefits from someone willing to say, "My lord." Perhaps let's think about that for another moment. History tends to celebrate heroes charging dramatically into danger. It should probably celebrate cautious advisors a little more often. They quietly prevent many disasters before anyone notices. Edward's court developed its own atmosphere. Unlike many royal households consumed entirely by ceremony, the prince encouraged conversation. Knights debated tactics over supper. Minstrels performed after evening meals. Travelers shared stories from distant kingdoms. Scholars discussed ancient Rome. Falconers displayed remarkable birds trained with astonishing patience. The prince genuinely enjoyed listening. Curiosity became one of his greatest strengths. He understood that wisdom rarely arrived wearing only one kind of clothing. Sometimes it carried a sword, sometimes a monk's robe, sometimes a merchant's cloak, sometimes muddy boots. By 1355, England prepared for another major campaign in France. King Edward III intended to pressure French forces across several fronts. His eldest son received independent command. This alone revealed extraordinary confidence. The prince would no longer merely support experienced commanders. He would lead. Thousands of lives would depend upon his decisions. Failure would be remembered across Europe. Success. Well, success often creates legends. Edward assembled his army in the English-held territory of Gascony in southwestern France. Unlike northern campaigns, this region felt entirely different. Rolling vineyards stretched across warm hillsides. Broad rivers reflected endless blue skies. Stone villages overlooked fertile valleys. The climate seemed almost gentle compared with England's damp countryside. Wine replaced ale at many tables. Olive trees appeared alongside ancient castles. The prince admired the landscape. It reminded him that France was not simply an enemy. It was also beautiful. War possesses an unfortunate habit of unfolding in lovely places. His army numbered perhaps 6,000 or 7,000 men. Not enormous. Certainly not by medieval standards. Yet almost every soldier had experience. Longbowmen, mounted knights, men-at-arms, Welsh archers, engineers, scouts, blacksmiths, carpenters, wagon drivers, priests, cooks. An army resembles a traveling town far more than a collection of warriors. Someone always needed bread. Someone always needed horseshoes. Someone inevitably misplaced something important, probably immediately after insisting they had packed it carefully. The prince's objective resembled earlier English strategy. The chevauchée. Ride swiftly across enemy territory. Destroy supplies. Undermine French confidence. Force the enemy king into action. It was brutal. Effective. Controversial even in its own time. Edward understood the moral complexity. Burning villages seldom feels heroic. Yet medieval warfare rarely offered clean choices. Every commander balanced military necessity against human suffering. Some balanced more successfully than others. The campaign moved steadily northward. Columns of mounted soldiers wound through forests glowing with late summer sunlight. Dust rose behind thousands of horses. Church bells rang warning as villages spotted the approaching army. Peasants hurried livestock toward distant woods. Castle gates slammed shut. Smoke gradually marked the prince's progress across France. Edward rode at the front more often than not. He insisted upon seeing the countryside personally. Commanders who remained comfortably behind maps frequently misunderstood reality. Roads that appeared simple upon parchment became rivers of mud after rain. Bridges collapsed. Streams flooded unexpectedly. Forests concealed ambushes. Maps rarely mentioned inconvenient hills. The prince preferred certainty, even if achieving it required uncomfortable riding. Each evening, the army established camp with practiced efficiency. Tents appeared almost magically. Cookfires flickered beneath the stars. Archers repaired arrows. Armorers hammered dents from helmets. Priests conducted evening prayers. Some soldiers sang quietly. Others cleaned weapons in thoughtful silence. Edward often walked through these camps after supper. He learned names, asked questions, listened more than he spoke. One veteran longbowman later remarked that the prince remembered ordinary soldiers remarkably well. Whether memory or genuine interest mattered more hardly seems important. The effect remained the same. Men fought more willingly for leaders who noticed them. As weeks passed, news arrived that King John II of France had finally committed himself to stopping the English advance. Unlike Crécy, where confusion and haste had plagued the French response, this time the king intended a more deliberate confrontation. He gathered one of the finest armies France could field. Thousands of armored knights, professional men-at-arms, crossbowmen, infantry, noble banners from across the kingdom. The French outnumbered Edward's force considerably. Again, the prince almost smiled upon hearing the reports. History, it seemed, enjoyed repeating certain patterns. One evening, Sir John Chandos spread maps across a rough wooden table inside the prince's tent. Candlelight danced across inked rivers and carefully drawn roads. The king approaches from the north. Edward studied the map. We continue. Chandos nodded slowly. For now. Another commander frowned. If he catches us? The older knight answered calmly. Then we choose the ground carefully. Edward looked up. My father taught me that. He taught us all. Simple lessons. Repeated often enough. Eventually, they become instinct. The English army maneuvered skillfully through the countryside, avoiding unnecessary risks while searching for favorable positions. Scouts rode constantly. Some returned with valuable information. Others never returned at all. Reconnaissance has always been dangerous work. Every army depends upon people willing to disappear quietly beyond the horizon. History rarely remembers their names. It probably should. By September, the two armies finally drew close. Near the city of Poitiers, the landscape differed markedly from Crécy. Gentle hills rolled across vineyards and cultivated fields. Ancient hedgerows divided farmland into narrow strips. Patches of woodland interrupted open ground. Small streams wound lazily through shallow valleys. Beautiful country. Soon to become another battlefield. Edward selected his position with extraordinary care. His army occupied slightly elevated ground protected by thick hedges, vineyards, and narrow lanes. French cavalry would struggle to maneuver effectively. Longbowmen found excellent fields of fire. Again, terrain became England's silent ally. The prince walked the position personally. He inspected every hedgerow, every slope, every approach. Commanders pointed toward likely French routes of attack. Archers measured distances almost instinctively. Experience had sharpened everyone's judgment. This would not be Crécy. It would be something new. Yet familiar lessons still applied. Before battle, an unexpected effort at negotiation unfolded. Cardinal Talleyrand, representing the church, attempted to prevent bloodshed. Meetings took place. Offers exchanged. Prisoners discussed. Territories debated. For a brief moment, peace seemed possible. Edward listened respectfully. He genuinely preferred avoiding unnecessary slaughter. Despite later legends portraying him as relentlessly warlike, contemporary accounts suggest otherwise. He admired battle when necessary, not for its own sake. Negotiations ultimately failed. Neither side would accept the other's conditions. The cardinal departed sadly. Another opportunity slipped away. History often hinges upon conversations that almost succeeded. That evening, the prince walked alone for a short distance beyond the English camp. The sky glowed crimson as the sun disappeared behind distant hills. Grapevines rustled gently in the evening breeze. Somewhere nearby, crickets sang. From across the valley came faint sounds of the French camp. Trumpets. Voices. The occasional neigh of restless horses. Thousands of men prepared for tomorrow. Most would survive. Some would not. No one knew which group they belonged to. Edward knelt briefly beneath an old oak tree. Whether he prayed or simply reflected, only he knew. Perhaps he remembered Crécy. Perhaps Woodstock. Perhaps his mother. Perhaps nothing at all. Sometimes silence itself becomes a kind of prayer. Back inside camp, Sir John Chandos found the prince examining his armor. Each buckle, each strap, each rivet. Carefully. Methodically. You've checked it 3 times. Edward smiled. I know. The older knight waited. The prince finally admitted. It won't change tomorrow. No. It simply gives my hands something useful to do. Chandos laughed quietly. I've heard that somewhere before. Edward laughed as well. The old soldier from Crécy, sharpening his sword beside the fire. The prince had remembered. Preparation could not erase uncertainty, but it gave uncertainty less room to grow. Night settled gently across the vineyards of Poitiers. Campfires glimmered beneath countless stars. Owls hunted through nearby woods. A cool breeze carried the scent of crushed grapes and damp earth. The prince finally lay down to rest. Tomorrow he would face not merely another army, but the King of France himself. If England prevailed, the balance of power across Europe would change forever. If England failed, everything achieved since Crécy might disappear. Morning was approaching, and with it, one of the greatest battles of the 100 Years' War, the Battle of Poitiers, the day a king became a prisoner. Before sunrise, the vineyards were silent. A thin blanket of mist drifted between the rows of vines, softening every hill and hedgerow until the countryside seemed almost dreamlike. Dew clung to spider webs stretched between weathered fence posts. Somewhere, hidden beyond the trees, a nightingale sang its final notes before yielding the morning to crows and sparrows. It was difficult to imagine that within a few hours this peaceful valley would echo with the sound of steel striking steel. Nature, as always, appeared completely unconcerned with human plans. The vines continued growing. The birds continued singing. Only people believed the world was about to change forever. Edward of Woodstock woke before the camp stirred. Years of campaigning had trained his body to wake naturally before dawn. He dressed quietly, fastening each piece of armor with practiced precision. First came the padded gambeson, then the mail. Steel plates followed. Greaves protected his legs. Gauntlets enclosed his hands. Finally, the helmet rested beneath his arm while he stepped outside into the cool September air. Around him, campfires glowed like scattered stars across the dark fields. A few sentries nodded respectfully. No one spoke loudly. The silence before battle possesses a strange quality. It is not empty. It is full of thoughts no one wishes to say aloud. The prince walked through the camp one final time. Some soldiers slept despite everything. Veterans often could. Experience teaches that worrying through the night merely guarantees exhaustion by morning. Others sat quietly sharpening swords that already seemed perfectly sharp. One man repaired a torn bootlace with extraordinary concentration. Another carefully folded a letter from home before placing it inside his tunic. Tiny rituals. Small acts of normality. Human beings cling to them when uncertainty grows overwhelming. Edward recognized many faces. The same archers who had marched beside him for weeks. The same knights who had survived Crécy. The same cooks who somehow continued producing edible meals from increasingly questionable ingredients. They smiled as he passed. He smiled back. No grand speech. No dramatic promises. Their confidence rested less upon words than upon shared experience. As daylight strengthened, scouts returned. The French army was approaching. Not slowly. Deliberately. King John II had finally committed himself. His force stretched across the landscape in magnificent order. Bright banners marked the positions of great noble houses. Trumpets echoed through the valley. Thousands of helmets flashed beneath the rising sun. The king himself rode among his household knights wearing splendid armor decorated with golden lilies. Unlike Philip VI at Crécy, John intended to command personally from the heart of the battle. He was brave. No one doubted that. History would remember him for many things. Cowardice would never be one of them. Edward climbed a small rise overlooking the field. Sir John Chandos joined him. For several minutes, neither man spoke. The French looked impressive, perhaps overwhelming. Eventually, the prince asked quietly, "How many?" Chandos shrugged. "Enough." The prince laughed softly. "I suspected that." Exact numbers remain uncertain even today. Medieval chroniclers possessed remarkable imaginations when counting armies. Some accounts claim impossibly large figures, others much smaller. What mattered was simpler. The French outnumbered the English significantly. Again. History had indeed repeated itself. Edward gathered his commanders. Maps were unnecessary now. The battlefield lay before them. The prince spoke calmly. "No one moves without orders." Heads nodded. "The archers hold until the signal." Again, agreement. "If the line bends." He paused. "It does not break." Simple instructions. Easy to remember. Precisely what frightened men required. Complicated plans often dissolve amid battle. Simple ones survive. The English position remained remarkably strong. High hedges bordered narrow lanes. Vineyards interrupted open ground. Small rises offered clear fields of fire. Longbowmen concealed themselves carefully along the flanks. Knights prepared to fight mostly on foot, preserving strength while presenting smaller targets. Every lesson from Crécy had been remembered. Every mistake avoided. Edward had learned. So had his army. Around mid-morning, Cardinal Talleyrand made one final attempt to prevent bloodshed. He rode between the armies beneath a white banner. Church officials accompanied him. For several anxious hours, negotiations resumed. Perhaps peace still remained possible. The French demanded unconditional surrender. Edward refused. The English offered concessions. France declined. Eventually, the cardinal returned sadly. The opportunity vanished. Again. History occasionally resembles two stubborn men arguing while an entire village quietly catches fire behind them. The battle began not with thunderous cavalry, but with careful movement. French commanders advanced cautiously. They had studied Crécy. They intended avoiding previous mistakes. Some knights dismounted. Infantry moved forward. Crossbowmen prepared. It was a better plan. Whether it proved good enough remained another question. Edward waited. Patience. Always patience. His father had taught him that years earlier while overlooking English forests. His advisors repeated it endlessly. Now came the test. The French approached steadily. Closer. Closer. Still the prince waited. Longbowmen stood motionless. Bowstrings remained relaxed. Arrows untouched. Some younger soldiers shifted nervously. Veterans remained almost unnaturally calm. They had seen this before. Finally, Edward lowered his hand. The signal. Thousands of longbows bent simultaneously. The familiar sound swept across the battlefield. A deep rushing hiss. Almost beautiful. Until one remembered what followed. Arrows filled the sky. Dark clouds of feathered death descended upon the advancing French. Men stumbled. Horses screamed. Formation slowed. Yet, unlike Crécy, the French continued advancing with remarkable determination. They had learned. Partially. The fighting intensified rapidly. French men at arms reached the English line. Axes crashed against shields. Polearms thrust through narrow openings. Swords rang sharply across helmets. Dust rose beneath hundreds of struggling feet. The hedgerows restricted movement exactly as Edward intended. French numbers could not fully deploy. Small groups fought desperate contests measured in yards rather than miles. Individual courage suddenly mattered enormously. The prince remained wherever danger seemed greatest. He rode constantly along the line, encouraging exhausted soldiers. At one point, an English standard dipped dangerously as its bearer fell wounded. Edward seized the banner himself until another knight took it. Small moments. Rarely mentioned in official reports. Yet soldiers remembered them. Leadership often consists of dozens of tiny actions invisible to history. Sir John Chandos repeatedly urged caution. "My lord." Edward barely glanced toward him. "You cannot be everywhere." "No. But I can be where I'm needed." The older knight sighed. "And if you fall?" Edward smiled beneath his helmet. "Then you'll have considerably more work, even amid battle." A little humor survived. Perhaps because without it fear becomes unbearable. Hours passed. Neither army gained decisive advantage. The French pressed relentlessly. English resistance stiffened. Bodies accumulated along the hedgerows. Broken spears littered vineyards. Abandoned helmets reflected the midday sun. Exhaustion spread through both armies. Men who had begun the morning full of energy now struggled simply to lift their shields. War is remarkably tiring. An obvious statement, yet one often forgotten. Then Edward noticed something. The French center had advanced farther than the flanks. A gap. Small. Temporary. But real. He turned immediately toward Chandos. There. The knight studied the battlefield. His eyes widened. "I see it." The prince spoke quickly. "How many mounted men remain?" "Enough." Again, that wonderfully imprecise medieval answer. "Enough." Sometimes history changes because someone decides enough will suffice. Edward issued one of the most important orders of his life. A reserve of mounted knights, hidden carefully behind the English position, would circle around the enemy flank. Not a reckless charge, a calculated strike. While the French remained fully engaged at the front, English cavalry would appear unexpectedly from the side. Timing became everything. Too early. the French would respond. Too late. The opportunity disappeared. The maneuver unfolded almost perfectly. Hidden by folds in the landscape, English horsemen moved swiftly through narrow lanes before emerging suddenly upon the French flank. The effect proved devastating. Already exhausted soldiers found themselves attacked from an unexpected direction. Confusion spread. Orders became difficult to hear. Banners disappeared within swirling dust. Some units believed they had been surrounded. Others began retreating. Retreat spread panic astonishingly quickly. Military discipline is remarkably fragile once uncertainty appears. King John II refused to flee. Contemporary chroniclers admired his extraordinary courage. He fought on foot surrounded by loyal household knights. His young son Philip remained beside him throughout the struggle. The French king swung his battle axe personally, resisting every English assault. One can only imagine the exhaustion. Hours of fighting. Heavy armor. Relentless pressure. Yet he continued. Sometimes history grants even defeated leaders magnificent moments. This became one of John's. Eventually resistance collapsed around the king. English soldiers closed in. Accounts differ regarding precisely who accepted John's surrender. Several men later claimed the honor, perhaps understandably. Capturing the King of France represented rather an impressive achievement for one's professional resume. However it occurred, the outcome remained extraordinary. King John II became Edward's prisoner, a reigning monarch. Captured alive upon the battlefield, Europe stood astonished. Such events were exceedingly rare. When the fighting finally ended, silence returned gradually. Not complete silence. Never that. Wounded men still cried for help. Physicians hurried between casualties. Priests whispered prayers. Horses wandered riderless across trampled vineyards. Yet compared with the chaos of battle, the quiet felt almost sacred. Edward removed his helmet slowly. Sweat soaked his hair. Dust covered every piece of armor. He looked older than he had that morning. Victories often do that. Soon afterward, the captured King John was brought before the prince. Imagine the moment. The victorious English commander, the defeated King of France, both exhausted, both covered in dust, both fully aware that history would remember this meeting. Edward stepped forward immediately. He bowed respectfully, not mockingly, genuinely. He addressed John with every courtesy due his rank. According to chroniclers, the prince even served the French king at supper that evening, refusing to humiliate his captive. It was a remarkable display of chivalry. Europe heard about it almost as quickly as news of the battle itself. The prince had defeated a king, then treated him with honor. Such stories became legend, not merely because they sounded noble, because people desperately wanted to believe nobility still existed amid endless war. The victory at Poitiers transformed Edward of Woodstock forever. Crécy had announced his arrival. Poitiers confirmed his greatness. Kings admired him. Enemies respected him. Poets celebrated him. Across Europe, people began speaking of the English prince with a mixture of awe and apprehension. Somewhere during these years, the name that history would never forget began quietly attaching itself to him. Not simply Edward. Not merely the Prince of Wales, but the Black Prince. No one at the time fully understood why. The mystery itself would become part of the legend. Why was he called the Black Prince? The rise of a medieval legend. Names are curious things. Most people spend an entire lifetime answering to the one they receive shortly after birth. A few collect nicknames along the way, some affectionate, others considerably less flattering. History, however, has a habit of inventing names long after the people themselves have disappeared. Edward of Woodstock never introduced himself as the Black Prince. No official document signed during his lifetime calls him that. No contemporary chronicler records soldiers cheering, "Long live the Black Prince." The title would emerge decades after his death. And even now, historians still debate exactly why. Imagine walking through England sometime in the late 15th century, more than 100 years after Edward's lifetime. The old prince has become legend. Grandfathers tell stories about Crécy and Poitiers to children sitting beside winter fires. Traveling minstrels sing of impossible courage. Monks copying old chronicles quietly compare Edward to heroes from ancient Rome. Memory has begun performing its favorite trick, smoothing rough edges, brightening victories, softening failures, turning complicated human beings into symbols. Somewhere during that long process, the phrase "the Black Prince" appears. Not immediately, not consistently, gradually, like mist settling across a familiar landscape. So why black? One possibility seems almost obvious: armor. Edward frequently fought wearing darkened steel. Many noblemen polished their armor until it gleamed brilliantly beneath the sun. Others preferred darker finishes that resisted rust more effectively. A commander wearing blackened armor would have appeared striking on the battlefield. Imagine him riding through drifting smoke after battle. Dark armor, black horse, tattered banner fluttering overhead. The image certainly lingers in the imagination. Whether it inspired the nickname, we cannot say with certainty. History occasionally refuses to answer our most interesting questions. Another theory points toward heraldry. Edward's personal shield famously displayed the 3 golden lions of England combined with the lilies of France. His famous ostrich feathers appeared upon banners and badges. Black often surrounded these brilliant colors, creating powerful visual contrast. Medieval people understood symbolism deeply. Every color carried meaning. Every animal upon a shield told a story. Perhaps later generations simply remembered the prince through darker imagery associated with his heraldic devices. Perhaps. Again, no one truly knows. Then there is another possibility, a darker one. Some French chroniclers remembered Edward not only as a brilliant commander, but as a devastating enemy. The chevauchés he led through France left burned villages, ruined harvests, and frightened populations. To English writers, these campaigns demonstrated military genius. To many French families, they represented catastrophe. History often depends upon where one happens to stand. Victors admire strategy. Those whose homes burn tend to use rather different vocabulary. Could Black Prince reflect fear? The darkness of war itself? Some historians think so. Others disagree. Perhaps the greatest mystery is that no single explanation entirely satisfies, which somehow feels appropriate. Legends rarely grow from one simple fact. They accumulate slowly, story upon story, memory upon memory, until eventually the legend becomes almost more real than the person. Edward of Woodstock transformed into the Black Prince not through one battle, but through generations of storytelling. The prince himself remained remarkably busy ignoring future nicknames. Following Poitiers, he found himself responsible for something unprecedented. He now held the King of France prisoner. A captured monarch presented unique logistical challenges. Where exactly does one keep a king? You cannot simply lock him inside an ordinary tower and hope for the best. Royal prisoners required dignity, comfort, security, political sensitivity. Edward approached the responsibility with extraordinary courtesy. King John II accompanied the prince not as a humiliated captive dragged in chains. Instead, he traveled almost like an honored guest. The French king retained servants, enjoyed comfortable accommodations, shared meals with English nobles. He even hunted occasionally. One modern observer joked that John became the most politely imprisoned king in Europe. There was truth in the humor. Ransom, after all, remained central to medieval warfare. Living kings proved far more valuable than dead ones. When Edward escorted John across France toward the coast, curious crowds gathered along roadsides. They expected spectacle. Instead, they witnessed something unusual. The victorious prince frequently treated the defeated king with remarkable respect. The two men conversed often. They discussed politics, hunting, religion, the burdens of leadership. Perhaps they even laughed together occasionally. Shared hardship creates unexpected connections. Both understood responsibilities few others could imagine. Both had watched thousands of men die because of decisions they themselves had made. Such experiences isolate people. Sometimes, even enemies understand one another better than friends. Crossing the English Channel once again, Edward reflected upon everything that had happened since leaving England as a 16-year-old boy 10 years earlier. He remembered the nervous excitement before Crécy, the endless months outside Calais, the terrible silence brought by the plague, the vineyards around Poitiers, the moment King John surrendered, how quickly life had changed. The sea remained unchanged. Waves rolled endlessly beneath gray skies. Seagulls circled overhead. Salt spray coated every rope. Ships creaked exactly as they always had. Nature possesses little interest in human reputations. England greeted the prince like a conquering hero. Church bells rang across London. Crowds filled narrow streets. Merchants abandoned their stalls to glimpse the returning army. Children climbed barrels and fences hoping to see the famous commander. The captured French king attracted equal fascination. Few English people had ever imagined seeing a foreign monarch riding through their capital as a prisoner. It seemed almost unbelievable. Edward entered the city beneath fluttering banners, while people cheered from windows and rooftops. Flowers scattered beneath horses' hooves. Musicians played. Priests offered blessings. For one shining moment, England believed almost anything was possible. King Edward III embraced his son warmly. The old king had always admired courage. Now he admired something else: judgment. Poitiers had not been won merely through bravery. It had been won through patience, discipline, careful observation. Edward had become more than an exceptional knight. He had become an exceptional commander. The distinction mattered enormously. Great warriors inspire admiration. Great commanders change history. Celebrations continued for weeks. Feasts filled Westminster Hall. Enormous fireplaces illuminated banquets attended by nobles from across Europe. Musicians played late into the evening. Acrobats entertained guests. Roasted swans decorated royal tables. Venison arrived from royal forests. Fine wines flowed generously. One suspects several cooks quietly wished the festivities might conclude before someone requested another 12-course banquet. Royal kitchens worked almost as hard as armies. The prince accepted praise graciously. Yet those closest to him noticed little change in his daily habits. He still rose early. Still trained regularly. Still inspected horses personally. Still listened carefully during military discussions. Success had enlarged his reputation. It had not yet enlarged his ego. That balance impressed contemporaries enormously. Many medieval nobles became insufferably proud after comparatively minor victories. Edward remained approachable, at least according to those who served beside him. Around this time, another important figure entered the prince's life: Joan of Kent. If Edward represented one of medieval Europe's most celebrated warriors, Joan represented one of its most remarkable noblewomen. She possessed beauty, intelligence, political experience, and a life story almost as dramatic as Edward's own. Their relationship had begun years earlier, though circumstances delayed marriage. Joan had already endured scandal, disputed marriages, legal battles, and public scrutiny that would have overwhelmed many people. Yet she emerged with dignity intact. Edward admired her deeply, not merely for her appearance, for her resilience. Their marriage in 1361 became one of England's happiest royal unions. Unlike many medieval marriages arranged solely for political convenience, this one appears genuinely affectionate. Contemporary accounts repeatedly describe warmth between husband and wife. They hunted together, traveled together, shared responsibilities. Joan accompanied Edward on many important occasions. She understood court politics exceptionally well. The prince valued her counsel. History sometimes forgets how influential capable partners can be. Kings and princes often receive credit for decisions shaped quietly by conversations no chronicler ever recorded. Soon afterward, Edward received perhaps the greatest administrative responsibility of his life. His father appointed him Prince of Aquitaine. The vast duchy in southwestern France would become Edward's domain. He would not merely command armies there. He would govern, collect taxes, settle disputes, administer justice, encourage trade, maintain peace. Leadership during war is difficult. Leadership during peace can prove even harder. Battles offer clear objectives. Government rarely does. Edward departed England once again. not as an invading commander, as a ruler. His new capital at Bordeaux welcomed him with celebration. Merchants lined the streets. Church bells rang. Citizens greeted their new prince enthusiastically. The vineyards stretched endlessly beyond the city walls. The Garonne River carried ships toward the Atlantic. Warm southern sunlight replaced England's familiar gray skies. For a moment, it seemed Edward's greatest challenges lay behind him. History, however, rarely allows such comfortable conclusions. The prince stood at the height of his power. His victories unmatched. His reputation unequaled. His marriage happy. His future seemingly limitless. Yet somewhere beyond the bright vineyards of Aquitaine, new conflicts were already taking shape. Old allies would become uncertain friends. Illness waited patiently in the years ahead. And one ambitious king in Spain would soon draw the Black Prince into the campaign that changed his life forever. The brightest chapter of Edward's story had reached its peak. Very slowly, almost imperceptibly, the shadows were beginning to lengthen. Aquitaine, the prince who learned that governing is harder than winning battles. Morning arrived differently in Aquitaine. The sun climbed earlier than it did in England, spilling warm golden light across endless vineyards that rolled gently toward the horizon. The Garonne River shimmered like polished silver, carrying merchant ships laden with wine casks toward the Atlantic. Church bells drifted lazily through the air, mingling with the distant voices of fishermen preparing their boats and farmers already working among the vines. If England smelled of damp forests, wet stone, and sea wind, Aquitaine smelled of grapes, fresh bread, warm earth, lavender, olive oil. It was a land made for peaceful living, which, naturally, made it an excellent place for medieval politics to become extraordinarily complicated. Edward and Joan entered Bordeaux with all the ceremony expected of one of Europe's greatest princes. The city greeted them enthusiastically. Guild banners fluttered from windows. Children scattered flowers beneath their horses. Merchants lined the streets hoping to glimpse the famous victor of Crécy and Poitiers. Church choirs sang hymns that echoed through narrow stone streets. Wine flowed generously, perhaps a little too generously. After all, this was Bordeaux. Offering less wine would probably have been considered deeply suspicious. The prince quickly discovered that ruling a prosperous duchy differed entirely from leading an army. In battle, problems often announce themselves quite clearly. Someone attacks. You respond. Simple. Government preferred subtler methods. Disputes over taxes. Arguments about land ownership. Complaints from merchants. Conflicts between local nobles. Questions of law. Questions about earlier questions. And occasionally questions regarding why no one had answered the previous questions. Administration rarely inspires epic poems. Yet kingdoms survive because someone patiently deals with paperwork. Edward established his court in Bordeaux. Unlike the hurried military camps he knew so well, this became a true center of government. Judges arrived carrying thick bundles of legal documents. Clerks copied letters late into the night. Messengers departed daily for distant castles. Merchants requested trading privileges. Bishops discussed church matters. Foreign ambassadors sought audiences. The prince's great hall echoed less with the clash of swords, and more with careful conversation. Sometimes history changes because someone signs the correct document. Joan of Kent flourished in Aquitaine. She possessed remarkable political instincts. Visitors frequently commented upon her intelligence, grace, and calm manner. She welcomed nobles from across southern France, helping build relationships that Edward needed desperately. Many disputes ended more peacefully after Joan quietly spoke with the people involved. Not every victory requires a battlefield. Sometimes diplomacy succeeds where armies fail. Joan understood that better than most. The people of Aquitaine viewed Edward with cautious optimism. Many had lived under English rule for decades and enjoyed profitable trade with England. Others remained uncertain. After all, the 100 Years' War had transformed loyalties into remarkably complicated matters. A nobleman might owe allegiance to England while maintaining relatives loyal to France. A merchant might profit enormously from English rule while privately preferring French customs. Ordinary villagers often cared far less about distant kings than about whether next year's harvest would be good. Politics becomes wonderfully simple only in history books. Real life insists upon considerably more nuance. Edward traveled constantly throughout his territories. He refused to remain hidden inside Bordeaux. Instead, he visited castles, monasteries, villages, and marketplaces across Aquitaine. He listened to local officials, inspected defenses, observed trade firsthand. He wanted to understand the land he governed. Roads carried him through forests alive with birdsong, across ancient Roman bridges still standing after 1,000 years, past vineyards stretching beneath brilliant blue skies. The countryside possessed a quiet dignity that Edward admired deeply. One afternoon, while riding through a small village near the Dordogne River, the prince stopped beside an elderly cooper making wine barrels. The craftsman bowed awkwardly. Edward dismounted. The old man seemed startled. "My lord." The prince picked up one of the finished barrels. "Beautiful workmanship." The cooper smiled proudly. "My father taught me." "And his father?" "Yes." Edward nodded thoughtfully. "Then your family has served Aquitaine longer than any prince." The old craftsman laughed. "So it seems." Moments like these rarely appear in official chronicles, yet they reveal character more clearly than grand ceremonies ever could. Edward encouraged trade wherever possible. English merchants eagerly purchased Aquitaine's famous wines. Ships crossed the channel almost continuously. Bordeaux prospered enormously. Warehouses expanded. Dockworkers found steady employment. Innkeepers welcomed foreign visitors. Money flowed. Prosperity generally creates happier subjects. Not universally, but often enough. The prince also patronized tournaments, music, literature, and religious foundations. His court became one of Europe's most admired cultural centers. Troubadours performed songs celebrating love, honor, and adventure. Poets composed verses praising knights. Scholars debated philosophy beneath castle arches. Falconers displayed magnificent hunting birds. Edward genuinely enjoyed these pursuits. Despite later legends emphasizing only warfare, he appreciated beauty wherever he found it. Fine horses, beautiful music, elegant architecture, well-made armor, excellent wine. Life offered pleasures worth protecting. Yet beneath this flourishing court, problems accumulated quietly. The duchy required enormous financial resources, maintaining castles, supporting officials, paying soldiers, repairing roads, funding diplomacy, hosting visiting nobles. Everything cost money, far more money than many subjects wished to provide. Taxes increased. Predictably, complaints followed. Human nature, it seems, has remained astonishingly consistent across the centuries. Very few people enjoy paying taxes, especially when convinced someone wealthier ought to pay instead. Among the most influential nobles growing dissatisfied was the Count of Armagnac. Others soon joined him. They argued that Edward demanded excessive financial contributions. Some questioned English authority altogether. Private disagreements slowly evolved into political opposition. Letters crossed France. Meetings occurred behind closed doors. Old loyalties quietly resurfaced. Edward sensed growing unrest. He attempted compromise where possible. Not every dispute responded to compromise. The prince's advisors warned him repeatedly. "My lord, they appeal to the French king." Edward frowned. "They are my subjects. For now." The words lingered. For now. Few phrases unsettle rulers more effectively. Power always feels permanent, until someone reminds you otherwise. Complicating everything further, Edward's own health began changing. At first, the symptoms appeared insignificant. Occasional fatigue, persistent stomach pain, periods of weakness following long journeys. Nothing dramatic. Campaigning had exhausted stronger men than he. He ignored the discomfort. Like countless soldiers before and after him, if one keeps working, surely the body eventually cooperates. As medical advice, this ranks somewhere below applying leeches to everything. Unfortunately, medieval medicine offered few better alternatives. Joan noticed before anyone else. She observed him eating less, resting more frequently, growing unusually quiet after council meetings. One evening she found him standing alone overlooking the river. "You aren't sleeping." Edward smiled faintly. "I sleep." "You pretend remarkably well." He laughed softly. "You always notice." "I always will." He hesitated. "I'm simply tired." Joan looked toward the sunset. "No." Another pause. "You're in pain." Edward did not answer. Sometimes silence confirms more than words. Despite his illness, Edward continued governing tirelessly. He believed responsibility outweighed personal comfort. He attended councils, reviewed petitions, met ambassadors, wrote inspections, hosted feasts. The people seldom saw weakness. Leaders often conceal suffering remarkably well, not because they enjoy pretending, because they fear uncertainty spreading through those depending upon them. By the mid-1360s, tensions within Aquitaine reached dangerous levels. Several powerful nobles appealed directly to King Charles V of France. Unlike his father, King John II, Charles preferred careful strategy over dramatic battles. He observed patiently, calculated carefully. Where Edward III sought decisive victories, Charles sought gradual advantage. He possessed a remarkably modern understanding of politics. Win slowly. Lose nothing unnecessarily. Let your opponent exhaust himself. It lacked the romance of charging cavalry. It proved astonishingly effective. Charles summoned Edward to appear before the French court to answer complaints from Aquitaine's nobles. The request carried enormous political significance. If Edward obeyed, he implicitly acknowledged French authority. If he refused, war became increasingly likely. The prince considered carefully. His advisors debated endlessly. Finally, Edward delivered his answer. He would indeed come to Paris, but with 60,000 men at my back. Whether he spoke those exact words remains uncertain. The spirit, however, perfectly captured the moment. Negotiation had ended. The road to war had reopened. The vineyards of Aquitaine still glowed beneath the afternoon sun. Ships still carried wine toward England. Church bells still echoed through ancient streets. To ordinary people, life seemed almost unchanged. History often behaves that way. Great turning points arrive quietly. No trumpet announces them. No mysterious voice whispers. This is the moment everything changes. People simply wake one morning and discover peace has slipped away while they were busy living ordinary lives. Edward stood upon the balcony of his palace in Bordeaux as evening settled across the river. The city lights flickered to life below. Somewhere nearby, musicians played softly in a courtyard. The air smelled of grapes ripening for harvest. It was beautiful, painfully beautiful. Because the prince suspected, he might soon lead another army through these peaceful lands. Not as their governor, not as their protector, but once again, as their commander in war. The Castilian campaign, victory at Nájera, and the beginning of the end. Spring arrived early across the Iberian Peninsula. Wildflowers spread across rolling hills beneath a sky so brilliantly blue that even seasoned English knights paused to admire it. Olive groves shimmered in the warm breeze. Almond trees bloomed in pale pink clouds. Mountain streams carried the last snow melt from distant peaks, their waters sparkling beneath the Spanish sun. It was a landscape unlike anything Edward of Woodstock had known in England. Beautiful, dry, ancient. A place where Romans had marched, Visigoths had ruled, Muslim emirs had built magnificent cities, and Christian kingdoms had spent centuries fighting to reclaim the peninsula. Now England's greatest prince was about to add his own chapter to that long story. The trouble began, as so many medieval troubles did, with two men who both believed they deserved the same throne. In the kingdom of Castile, King Pedro I had earned a reputation that depended entirely upon whom one asked. His supporters called him Pedro the Just. His enemies preferred Pedro the Cruel. History has rarely agreed on which title fits better. He could be generous one day, and terrifying the next. Politics, family rivalries, and personal vengeance intertwined until it became nearly impossible to separate one from another. Eventually, Pedro lost his throne to his half-brother, Henry of Trastamara. Henry enjoyed the support of France. Pedro sought help from England. Thus, another chapter of the Hundred Years' War quietly expanded into Spain. Because medieval Europe possessed a remarkable talent for ensuring that almost every local conflict eventually became everyone else's problem. Edward received Pedro in Aquitaine. The deposed king arrived not as a triumphant ruler, but as a desperate exile. His clothes remained splendid. His confidence seemed carefully rehearsed. Yet exhaustion lingered behind his eyes. He had crossed mountains and kingdoms seeking allies. Now he stood before the most celebrated commander in Europe. Pedro promised much: money, territories, military support in future wars. Rewards so generous they sounded almost irresistible. Edward listened carefully. Joan watched silently from nearby. Sir John Chandos remained thoughtful. Experienced men often become suspicious whenever someone promises enormous riches tomorrow, especially if they currently possess very little today. The prince faced a difficult decision. Helping Pedro offered clear advantages. An English-friendly Castile could weaken France considerably. Spanish ports might support English trade. French influence south of the Pyrenees would diminish. Strategically, the opportunity looked attractive. Practically, the campaign promised enormous expense. Marching thousands of soldiers across mountain ranges rarely qualifies as inexpensive. Neither does feeding them, or paying them, or replacing horses that inevitably decide mountain paths are entirely unreasonable places to work. Edward ultimately agreed, partly because strategy demanded action, partly because medieval honor placed enormous value upon supporting allies. Once he gave his word, he intended keeping it, even when doing so proved costly. Especially when doing so proved costly. That quality inspired immense loyalty among his followers. It would also contribute significantly to his future difficulties. Virtue occasionally presents rather expensive invoices. Preparations consumed months. Supplies accumulated throughout Aquitaine. Grain, salted meat, arrow shafts, bowstrings, replacement horseshoes, barrels of wine, medical herbs, blacksmith tools, tents. Every successful medieval campaign depended less upon glorious charges than upon astonishing quantities of practical equipment. Someone always needed another hammer, or another wagon wheel, or considerably more bread than anyone expected. Armies possess remarkable appetites. As the English force approached the Pyrenees, the mountains rose like enormous stone walls stretching across the horizon. Snow still crowned the highest peaks despite the warming spring below. Narrow passes wound upward between cliffs worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. Mules replaced wagons along some routes. Horses struggled over rocky paths. Progress slowed dramatically. The prince rode near the front, refusing easier travel. He insisted upon sharing the same hardships as his men. Cold mountain rain-soaked armor. Thin air exhausted soldiers unaccustomed to high elevations. Campfires burned reluctantly beneath icy winds. Several veterans quietly remarked that they almost missed English weather, which suggests conditions must have been genuinely unpleasant. Crossing the Pyrenees became an achievement in itself. Long columns stretched for miles. Knights guided frightened horses along dangerous ledges. Engineers repaired washed-out paths almost daily. Scouts searched constantly for enemy patrols. Occasionally, Edward paused simply to admire the view. Far below, valleys unfolded in shades of green and gold. Tiny villages clung to distant hillsides. Church bells floated faintly upward through the clear mountain air. Even amid military necessity, beauty remained impossible to ignore. Descending into Castile, the prince entered an entirely different world. Broad plains replaced mountain forests. Ancient Roman roads still crossed the countryside. Fortified towns crowned isolated hills. The climate grew warmer each day. Dust covered boots almost immediately after sunrise. Water became increasingly precious. English soldiers accustomed to cooler northern Europe quickly discovered that Spanish afternoons possessed little sympathy for heavily armored men. One longbowman reportedly joked that if the French failed to kill them, the sun seemed eager to volunteer. Meanwhile, Henry of Trastamara assembled his own forces. French knights accompanied him under the command of one of France's greatest captains, Bertrand du Guesclin. If Edward represented England's finest military mind, du Guesclin occupied a similar position for France. He lacked the glamorous appearance celebrated in Romantic poetry. Contemporary descriptions portray him as rough-featured, practical, almost stubbornly ordinary. Yet his intelligence proved extraordinary. He understood logistics, patience, terrain, psychology. He preferred winning efficiently rather than impressively. Edward respected him immensely. Even enemies recognized genuine talent. The opposing armies finally approached one another near the small town of Nájera in April 1367. Morning sunlight spread across the dry Spanish plain. The ground shimmered beneath growing heat. Unlike Crécy or Poitiers, vineyards and hedgerows offered little protection here. The battlefield lay open, broad, demanding different tactics. Edward studied the landscape carefully. Every battlefield tells commanders a story. Those who listen carefully survive more often. That evening, Edward gathered his senior officers. Maps lay scattered across a rough table. Candles flickered in the warm air. Sir John Chandos pointed toward nearby ridges. "They expect us tomorrow." Edward nodded. "So we won't come from where they expect." The prince proposed an overnight march around difficult terrain. Dangerous, exhausting, unexpected. If successful, the English would appear where Henry least anticipated. Several commanders exchanged uncertain glances. Night marches possessed an unfortunate tendency to become thoroughly confused, especially before electric lighting and clearly marked highways. The march began beneath brilliant stars. Moonlight silvered the rocky landscape. Thousands of soldiers moved almost silently. Only the soft clink of armor and the occasional snort of horses disturbed the night. Torches remained scarce. Darkness concealed them from enemy scouts. It also concealed inconvenient rocks, thorn bushes, and holes waiting patiently beneath unsuspecting boots. Several soldiers undoubtedly discovered these obstacles rather personally. History rarely records such moments. The feat certainly remembered them. Dawn revealed Edward's army exactly where Henry had not expected it. The surprise proved complete. French and Castilian commanders hurriedly reorganized their formations. Trumpets echoed frantically. Messengers galloped between confused units. Edward had seized the initiative before the first arrow flew. Sometimes victory begins several hours before battle officially starts. The fighting erupted with astonishing intensity. Longbowmen advanced steadily. Arrows darkened the bright Spanish sky. Castilian cavalry charged repeatedly. English men at arms held firm. Dust rose so thickly that portions of the battlefield disappeared entirely. Men fought almost blind beneath clouds of dry earth. Voices replaced vision. One followed banners, or familiar accents, or simply the night immediately beside you. Battle seldom resembles the clear panoramic paintings created afterward. More often it resembles organized confusion gradually becoming less organized. Edward remained constantly visible. He rode wherever pressure increased. His familiar blackened armor stood out against the pale Spanish dust. Soldiers pointed toward him repeatedly. The prince. Simple words. Powerful effect. Exhausted men found fresh determination merely by seeing their commander refusing to retreat. Leadership spreads remarkably quickly across a battlefield. So does fear. Wise commanders choose carefully which emotion they display. Sir John Chandos directed crucial maneuvers with characteristic calm. While younger knights sought dramatic charges, Chandos quietly repositioned reserves exactly where needed. Edward trusted him completely. The partnership resembled a finely crafted sword. Strong because every part performed its role perfectly. Neither man sought personal glory at the other's expense. Shared success mattered more. Such relationships remain surprisingly rare. In any century, gradually Henry's army began breaking apart. English pressure intensified relentlessly. French formations wavered. Castilian cavalry withdrew. Some units fled altogether. Bertrand du Guesclin continued fighting stubbornly until surrounded. Eventually, the famous French commander surrendered. Henry escaped the battlefield. Again. Pedro reclaimed his throne. Again. Edward had won another spectacular victory. Europe watched with admiration. The Black Prince appeared unstoppable. Yet beneath the triumph, cracks had already begun to appear. Pedro proved unable or unwilling to fulfill the magnificent promises he had made before the campaign. The enormous payments Edward expected never fully arrived. The campaign had cost the prince a fortune. Loans accumulated. Suppliers demanded payment. Mercenaries expected wages. Armies, unfortunately, do not accept gratitude as legal currency. Edward faced severe financial strain almost immediately. More troubling still, during or shortly after the campaign, the prince's mysterious illness worsened dramatically. The exact nature of his disease remains uncertain. Historians and physicians have suggested dysentery, chronic intestinal illness, malaria, kidney disease, or several other possibilities. No one knows for certain. What everyone noticed was change. The energetic commander who once rode tirelessly across France now tired more easily. Pain returned frequently. Long journeys became difficult. Joan worried constantly. Edward concealed symptoms whenever possible. But the body possesses remarkable determination when revealing uncomfortable truths. As the army slowly returned through the Pyrenees, the prince often rode in silence. Mountain winds swept across narrow passes. Snow glittered upon distant peaks. Victorious banners fluttered above weary columns. Outwardly, the campaign had succeeded brilliantly. Inwardly, Edward sensed something had shifted. Not politically. Personally. For the first time since childhood, he wondered whether his body might no longer obey his extraordinary will. It is one of life's cruelest lessons. Eventually, everyone discovers limits. Even legends. Especially legends. The road back to Aquitaine stretched before him. His greatest military victory since Poitiers lay behind him. But waiting beyond those familiar vineyards were debts, rebellion, illness, and the slow, heartbreaking realization that no commander, not even the Black Prince, could defeat every enemy. The fading light, illness, rebellion, and the burden of greatness. When Edward returned to Aquitaine, the vineyards were heavy with fruit. Rows upon rows of vines stretched beneath the late summer sun, their leaves glowing green and gold as warm winds drifted across the countryside. Harvest season had begun. Farmers sang quietly while gathering grapes into wicker baskets. Wooden carts creaked toward wineries where generations of families had pressed wine beneath the same ancient stone walls. From a distance, everything looked exactly as it should. The river still flowed. Church bells still rang each morning. Markets still filled with laughter. Children still chased one another through narrow streets. The world, it seemed, had politely decided not to notice that one of Europe's greatest princes was slowly becoming ill. History often behaves this way. It allows private tragedies to unfold beneath remarkably beautiful skies. Edward rode into Bordeaux not as the vigorous commander who had left months earlier, but as a man carrying burdens invisible to those cheering beside the streets. The citizens welcomed him warmly. They celebrated the victory at Nájera. They waved English banners. Wine merchants toasted his success. Musicians filled the squares with lively songs. Few noticed how carefully the prince dismounted, or how often he paused before climbing stairs, or how frequently he pressed a gloved hand against his side when he believed no one was watching. Those closest to him noticed. Joan noticed immediately. Sir John Chandos said nothing. He simply watched. Old soldiers often recognize suffering before physicians do. The prince attempted to resume normal government. Council meetings continued. Petitions arrived daily. Merchants requested new trading privileges. Judges sought guidance. Castles required repairs. Diplomats carried letters from England, France, Castile, and the papal court. Edward attended every meeting he could. He listened patiently. He made decisions carefully, but fatigue lingered. Hours that once passed easily now seemed strangely long. Concentration became difficult. The body has a quiet way of insisting upon limits. Even kings eventually discover that determination and health are not the same thing. Then came the debts. The Castilian campaign had drained Aquitaine's treasury. Pedro of Castile, whose throne Edward had restored, failed to provide the enormous payments he had promised. Some historians argue Pedro simply lacked the money. Others suggest he never truly intended to pay. Whatever the reason, the result remained the same. Edward now owed vast sums to soldiers, suppliers, and lenders. Honor demanded repayment. Honor, unfortunately, rarely came with convenient financing. To meet these obligations, Edward introduced a new tax across Aquitaine. It was called the feuillage, a household tax. From the prince's perspective, the decision seemed unavoidable. Armies had to be paid. Government had to function. Castles could not defend themselves. From the perspective of many local nobles and townspeople, it felt deeply unfair. Taxes possess a remarkable ability to unite otherwise disagreeing people. Soon complaints multiplied. Several powerful lords refused payment outright. Others appealed directly to King Charles V of France. Among them were the Counts of Armagnac and Albret, influential nobles who argued that Edward had exceeded his lawful authority. Charles listened carefully. Unlike many medieval rulers, he almost never hurried. He understood that wars could sometimes be won without dramatic battles. Patience, he believed, exhausted enemies more effectively than reckless courage. He had studied Edward carefully. Now he intended to challenge him in a different way. The French king summoned Edward to appear before the Parliament of Paris to answer the complaints. Legally, it was a brilliant move. Politically, it was almost impossible for the prince to accept. If Edward appeared before the French court, he would effectively recognize Charles as his superior. If he refused, Charles could claim that Edward had violated his obligations. Either outcome benefited France. It was a trap built not with swords, but with law. History reminds us that paperwork can occasionally be every bit as dangerous as warfare. Edward refused. His answer was firm. He remained Prince of Aquitaine by right of treaty. He would not submit himself to judgment in Paris. Charles responded exactly as many expected. In 1369, he declared Edward's lands forfeit. The fragile peace collapsed. The 100 Years' War began once again. This time, however, the circumstances were different. The prince who had dazzled Europe at Crécy and Poitiers no longer possessed the strength of his youth. French strategy had also changed. Charles placed increasing trust in Bertrand du Guesclin, the brilliant commander Edward had captured at Nájera. After being ransomed, du Guesclin returned to French service wiser than ever. He understood English tactics intimately. More importantly, he understood Edward himself. Rather than risking another great battle, du Guesclin adopted a strategy of attrition. Avoid decisive engagements. Capture isolated castles. Cut supply lines. Wear the English down slowly, frustratingly, relentlessly. It lacked the romance of cavalry charges. It won wars. Edward found this new style of conflict deeply challenging. He preferred decisive action. Battlefields where courage and planning could determine everything in a single day. Charles refused to offer him such opportunities. Instead, the prince watched French forces quietly reclaim town after town. Small victories accumulated. English influence gradually weakened. The map changed one castle at a time. Sometimes history moves not with explosions, but with gentle, persistent erosion. His illness worsened. Modern historians remain uncertain about its exact nature. Some suggest chronic dysentery contracted during the Spanish campaign. Others propose inflammatory bowel disease, kidney problems, or recurring infections. The truth has vanished with time. What remains are descriptions. Persistent weakness. Pain. Periods of fever. Exhaustion. Long stretches confined to bed. For a man whose identity had always depended upon movement, the suffering proved especially cruel. Joan rarely left his side during the worst periods. She managed court affairs quietly whenever Edward lacked strength. She received visitors, organized correspondence, comforted anxious servants, shielded the prince from unnecessary burdens whenever possible. Many later chroniclers praised Edward's military brilliance. Far fewer acknowledged Joan's extraordinary devotion. Yet without her, the final years of his rule in Aquitaine would have been far more difficult. History often remembers the person standing in front of the throne. It sometimes forgets the one standing quietly beside it. Sir John Chandos remained equally loyal. Whenever Edward insisted upon inspecting defenses despite obvious pain, Chandos rode beside him, not to discourage him, simply to ensure someone trustworthy remained close. The older knight understood something the prince refused to admit. Courage cannot cure illness. It can only endure it. Then, in 1370, tragedy struck. During a campaign near the town of Lussac-les-Châteaux, Sir John Chandos fought in a nighttime skirmish. The ground was muddy after rain. While charging forward, his foot slipped. He fell. Before he could fully recover, an enemy spear found the opening beneath his visor. The wound proved fatal. Edward received the news in stunned silence. No battlefield victory had prepared him for this. He had lost more than a commander. He had lost a friend who had shared nearly every triumph since Crécy. A man whose calm advice had shaped countless decisions. A companion who had quietly steadied England's greatest prince for decades. Some absences leave echoes that never truly fade. The prince attended Chandos's funeral with visible grief. Those present remarked upon his unusual silence. He spoke little. He simply stood watching as prayers drifted upward beneath gray autumn skies. Rain tapped gently against polished armor. Leaves fell from nearby trees. It seemed the season itself understood. Autumn has always possessed a peculiar talent for accompanying farewell. Only months later, another event forever stained Edward's reputation. The town of Limoges rebelled against English rule and opened its gates to French forces. The prince, despite severe illness, personally led the campaign to retake it. The city fell. What happened afterward remains one of the most debated episodes of his life. Some contemporary chroniclers, most famously Jean Froissart, described a terrible massacre in which thousands of civilians were killed. Later research suggests these numbers were almost certainly exaggerated, and that the victims were far fewer, likely numbering in the hundreds rather than thousands, with many being defenders rather than indiscriminate civilians. Even so, the capture of Limoges was brutal. Medieval sieges often were. Edward's enemies remembered it as proof of cruelty. His supporters argued it reflected the harsh customs of 14th century warfare rather than unusual savagery. The truth, as so often in history, lies somewhere between legend and reality. Edward himself may have understood that something had changed, not merely politically, personally. The prince who once symbolized youthful chivalry now carried the weight of illness, endless war, financial strain, and difficult decisions. Great leaders are rarely shaped by victories alone. They are shaped just as deeply by the choices they wish they had never been forced to make. As winter settled over Aquitaine, Edward stood one evening overlooking the vineyards that had once seemed full of endless promise. The vines were bare now. Branches twisted against a pale gray sky. Cold winds swept across the fields. For a long time he said nothing. Joan joined him quietly. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to say. The prince had spent nearly 20 years building a reputation unmatched across Europe. Now, he was beginning to understand the hardest lesson of all. No legend, however brilliant, can outride time. Homeward bound, the Black Prince returns to England. By the autumn of 1371, Aquitaine no longer felt like the hopeful land Edward had first entered a decade earlier. The vineyards still produced remarkable wine. The merchants still bargained loudly along the docks of Bordeaux. Church bells still echoed across the river each morning. Yet beneath these familiar rhythms, something fundamental had changed. French banners now flew above towns that had once sworn loyalty to England. Roads that had once seemed secure required armed escorts. Messengers rode with increasing urgency. Every council meeting carried another unwelcome report. Another castle lost. Another ally uncertain. Another expense impossible to ignore. War had become less dramatic, and somehow more exhausting. Edward knew what many around him refused to admit aloud. His body could no longer sustain the demands of command. The illness that had begun as occasional weakness had become a constant companion. Some mornings he struggled simply to rise from bed. Meals often ended untouched. Long rides left him pale with pain. His physicians prescribed familiar remedies. Herbal mixtures. Warm compresses. Bleeding. special diets, prayers, pilgrimages. Nothing offered lasting relief. Medieval medicine possessed remarkable confidence. It possessed rather less success. Joan watched the slow decline with quiet determination. She never allowed servants to speak of it openly. Court etiquette demanded strength. Appearances mattered. Visitors still encountered a prince dressed magnificently, speaking calmly, listening attentively. Only after audiences ended would Edward sometimes lean heavily against a chair, suddenly exhausted by the effort of simply appearing healthy. Illness is often invisible work. One spends as much energy pretending to be well as trying to become so. The decision finally became unavoidable. Edward would return to England. Officially, the journey allowed him to consult his father and recover his health. Unofficially, almost everyone understood. Aquitaine required a governor capable of constant travel and military leadership. The Black Prince could no longer provide either. It was not defeat. Not exactly. Something quieter. The acceptance that another season of life had begun. Preparations unfolded slowly. The prince insisted upon meeting local officials personally before departing. He thanked loyal nobles, rewarded faithful servants, settled disputes wherever possible. He wanted to leave Aquitaine with dignity. One by one, familiar faces came to say farewell. Merchants who had prospered under his protection, knights who had ridden beside him across France and Spain, clergy who had prayed for him during long campaigns, old soldiers whose hair had turned gray in English service. Many realized they would never see their prince again. One afternoon, Edward visited the vineyards outside Bordeaux, almost alone. Only a handful of attendants followed at a respectful distance. Harvest had recently ended. The vines stood quiet beneath the cool autumn sky. Workers repaired trellises for next year. Children gathered fallen grapes left behind after the harvest. The prince dismounted and walked slowly between the rows. He reached down and picked up a single dried vine leaf. It crumbled gently between his fingers. How quickly seasons changed. How quickly years had disappeared. He remembered arriving here young, energetic, convinced the future stretched endlessly before him. Now, the future seemed strangely uncertain. That evening, Joan found him watching the river. Ships drifted toward the Atlantic beneath fading sunlight. Thinking, Edward smiled. Remembering. She slipped her hand into his. What do you remember? He looked across the water. The first time I saw Bordeaux. And I thought I'd stay forever. Joan laughed softly. No one stays forever. No. Another silence. I simply forgot that for a while. The voyage home began beneath gray skies. English ships waited in the harbor, their sails snapping in the Atlantic wind. Baggage filled the holds. Horses stamped nervously aboard transport vessels. Servants hurried back and forth carrying chests, documents, armor, and personal belongings accumulated over years in Aquitaine. It is astonishing how much of a person's life can be packed into wooden boxes. Letters, books, weapons, small keepsakes, objects insignificant to everyone except their owner. Edward carried them all, along with memories that required no space at all. The sea crossing proved difficult. Autumn storms swept across the Bay of Biscay. Great waves tossed the ships relentlessly. Rain lashed the decks. Experienced sailors moved with practiced confidence, while everyone else discovered renewed appreciation for solid ground. Edward spent much of the voyage below deck, not from fear of the sea, from weakness. The constant motion aggravated his illness. Joan remained nearby almost constantly. She read letters aloud, shared quiet conversation. Sometimes they simply listened together as waves crashed against the hull. There are moments in marriage when words become unnecessary. England emerged from the mist exactly as Edward remembered. White cliffs rose dramatically above the sea. Fishing boats dotted the coastline. The air smelled cooler, sharper, familiar. Home possesses a scent difficult to describe until one has been away for many years. For Edward, England smelled of wet grass after rain, oak forests, wood smoke, salt carried inland by autumn winds. He breathed deeply, perhaps more deeply than he had managed in months. News of the prince's return spread quickly. Crowds gathered once again along roads leading toward London. Yet the celebrations differed from those following Poitiers. People still cheered, still waved banners, still admired their hero. But whispers accompanied the applause. He looks thinner. Is he unwell? He seems tired. Legends are expected to remain unchanged. Reality seldom cooperates. King Edward III embraced his son with unmistakable affection. The old king himself had aged considerably. Years of war, political burdens, and personal loss had taken their own toll. Father and son now resembled one another in unexpected ways. Both moved more slowly. Both carried grief behind their smiles. Both understood that time eventually claims every commander, regardless of victories. During private conversations, they spoke not only of France, but of family, of grandchildren, of old friends now gone, of memories stretching back to Woodstock Palace and childhood lessons in the forest. Sometimes history circles quietly back to where it began. Edward resumed residence largely at Windsor and later at Westminster, depending upon the needs of court. He remained deeply involved in government despite declining health. Foreign ambassadors still sought his advice. Military commanders still respected his judgment. Young nobles still admired him. He had become something new, less the sword of England, more its living memory. A reminder of what courage and discipline had accomplished during the greatest years of the war. Yet England itself had begun changing. A new generation had grown to adulthood. Many young knights knew Crécy and Poitiers only through stories. Children born during the plague were now becoming soldiers. The kingdom Edward had defended no longer looked exactly as it had when he first crossed the Channel. Such transformations happen quietly. One rarely notices them while living through them. Only upon returning after many years does the difference become unmistakable. The prince also found increasing comfort in quieter pursuits. He spent more time reading chronicles and religious texts. He listened to musicians in the evenings. He enjoyed conversations with scholars visiting the royal court. Hunting, once a favorite pastime, became difficult. Long rides exhausted him. Instead, he often watched younger men prepare their falcons or horses, smiling as memories surfaced. There is a peculiar peace in accepting that others must eventually continue the journey. Most precious of all remained time with his family. His sons, particularly the young Richard, increasingly occupied his thoughts. Edward understood something few fathers willingly consider. His own future had grown uncertain. The future belonged to his children now. Whatever legacy he had built, they would inherit both its glory and its burdens. He hoped they would inherit its wisdom as well. Hope, after all, is the one treasure every parent quietly tries to leave behind. Outside, another English winter slowly approached. Bare branches reached toward gray skies. Smoke curled from village chimneys. Frost silvered castle gardens before dawn. The Black Prince sat beside a window overlooking the Thames one cold evening, watching geese fly south across the fading light. For years he had ridden toward distant horizons. Now the horizons came gently to him. He did not yet know how little time remained. But somewhere deep inside, perhaps he had begun to suspect, the greatest battles of his life were over. The final chapter would demand a different kind of courage. Not the courage to charge into danger, but the courage to meet the quiet approach of the inevitable with the same dignity that had once carried him across the fields of Crécy and Poitiers. The final years, a prince, a father, and the shadow of mortality. There is a peculiar stillness that settles over royal palaces in winter. The great halls remain busy enough. Messengers continue arriving on horseback with mud frozen upon their boots. Servants hurry through endless corridors carrying firewood, candles, and steaming meals. Clerks scratch away with quills until late into the evening, recording the business of kings with remarkable patience. And yet, beyond the bustle, there is silence. The kind that comes when everyone understands that someone important is slowly fading. No one says it aloud. No one needs to. Edward of Woodstock was only in his mid-40s. By modern standards, remarkably young. By medieval standards, no longer young, but certainly not old enough to expect death. He had survived arrows, lances, battlefields, storms at sea, the Black Death. Political conspiracies. Years of exhausting campaigns. And yet it was not a French knight, nor a Castilian sword, that now threatened him. It was something unseen. Something living quietly inside his own body. History possesses an unfortunate sense of irony. The prince's illness now dictated the rhythm of his days. Some mornings he awoke with enough strength to attend council meetings, speak with ambassadors, or walk through the castle gardens. Other mornings, even standing required effort. Physicians visited constantly. They examined his pulse, observed his complexion, discussed the balance of the body's humors with absolute confidence, prescribed herbal tonics gathered from monastery gardens, suggested bleeding, suggested rest, suggested more prayer. Sometimes all three before breakfast. One cannot accuse medieval doctors of lacking enthusiasm. Joan of Kent became far more than a wife. She became Edward's closest companion, protector, and quiet strength. She arranged audiences so they would not exhaust him. She intercepted unnecessary disputes before they reached his chamber. She ensured he rested, even when he protested, which happened rather frequently. Edward had never enjoyed sitting still. The body insisted. The mind resisted. Joan usually won. Not through argument. Through gentle persistence. There are few forces in history more persuasive than someone who loves you and refuses to be intimidated by your titles. Their conversations changed during these years. Once they had discussed campaigns, diplomacy, castles, future plans. Now they spoke more often about memories. Woodstock, Aquitaine, the vineyards around Bordeaux, their children's laughter, the smell of hawks returning after successful hunts, the sound of rain striking tent canvas before dawn, the strange comfort of old stories retold many times. Memory became its own kingdom. One illness could not conquer. Their eldest surviving son had died several years earlier while they were still in Aquitaine. Little Edward of Angoulême had been only 6 years old. His death had broken something inside both parents. No victory. No title. No amount of wealth could repair that loss. Only one son now remained. Richard. A bright-eyed boy with delicate features and sharp intelligence. He adored his father. Edward adored him in return, perhaps even more deeply because he understood how fragile life could be. Whenever health permitted, Edward spent time teaching Richard. Not grand military strategy. Not yet. Instead, simple lessons. How to treat servants with respect. How to listen before speaking. Why promises mattered. Why courage required kindness. Sometimes they walked slowly through castle courtyards together. The prince pointed toward ancient walls. Do you know why castles stand so long? Richard considered carefully. They're built well. Edward smiled. Yes. And the boy frowned. People repair them. The prince nodded. Exactly. Then he rested a hand upon his son's shoulder. Kingdoms are much the same. Small lessons. Easy to overlook. Yet perhaps more valuable than swordsmanship. The English court continued functioning around them. King Edward III had grown increasingly frail himself. His once powerful presence diminished each passing year. Many of the companions who had built England's greatest victories were gone. Some had fallen in battle. Others had succumbed to plague. Age claimed the rest. The generation that had transformed England into Europe's dominant military power slowly disappeared. History was changing its cast of characters. Quietly. Almost politely. Among those who still visited Edward regularly were younger knights who had grown up hearing stories of Crécy and Poitiers. They expected to meet a legend. Instead, they encountered a thoughtful man who asked them more questions than he answered. One ambitious young noble once asked, "My lord, what was your greatest victory?" The prince looked thoughtfully toward the fire. After a long silence, he replied, "I survived long enough to regret some of them." The room fell silent. No one had expected that answer. Perhaps because youth often imagines victory as permanent. Age understands that every triumph leaves shadows somewhere. Edward remained deeply interested in military affairs despite his declining health. Maps still fascinated him. Messengers returning from France found an attentive audience. He analyzed campaigns carefully. Not with bitterness. With curiosity. Charles V and Bertrand du Guesclin had reshaped the war. Their patient strategy steadily reclaimed lands England had once believed permanently secure. Edward recognized the brilliance of their approach. One evening, he remarked quietly to a trusted advisor, "They learned from us." The advisor nodded. "They did." The prince smiled faintly. "Then perhaps we taught them too well." History's greatest teachers often create their own future rivals. Outside the palace walls, England itself faced growing uncertainty. Taxes increased. The cost of endless war burdened ordinary people. Veterans returned carrying wounds visible and invisible. The plague revisited parts of Europe in smaller outbreaks. Harvests varied. Merchants worried. Farmers prayed for favorable weather. Life continued. As it always does. Grand political struggles rarely interrupt the ordinary business of baking bread or tending sheep. People still married. Still buried loved ones. Still laughed during village festivals. History is lived far more often than it is written. Edward sometimes watched these ordinary lives from castle windows. Farmers guiding plows across distant fields. Children racing along muddy roads. Fishermen casting nets into the Thames. For much of his youth, he had imagined history belonging primarily to kings and commanders. Now, he suspected otherwise. Perhaps history belonged equally to those who quietly endured its consequences. The widow rebuilding after war. The blacksmith repairing armor. The monk preserving books. The shepherd watching seasons change while armies marched somewhere beyond distant hills. Empires rise and fall. Someone still has to milk the cows. Civilization depends rather heavily upon such practical realities. By early 1376, everyone close to the prince recognized the truth. Recovery no longer seemed likely. His illness advanced steadily. He tired after even brief conversations. Walking required assistance more frequently. Pain became constant. Yet remarkably, contemporary accounts suggest he remained patient, courteous, thoughtful. Not cheerful exactly, but peaceful. There is dignity in accepting realities one cannot alter. Edward seemed to understand this. One cold evening in the spring, Richard climbed onto the bed beside his father carrying a small wooden knight carved by one of the palace craftsmen. The boy proudly held it up. "It looks like you." Edward examined the tiny figure. The carved knight wore armor, carried a shield, held a sword. The prince smiled warmly. "Does he always win?" Richard thought carefully. "No." Edward raised an eyebrow. "No." The boy shook his head. "But he always gets back up." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Edward quietly embraced his son. Children sometimes discover truths philosophers spend entire lifetimes pursuing. As spring blossoms appeared once more across England, the Black Prince found himself thinking less about battles and more about time. Time spent riding beside his father through ancient forests. Time laughing with Sir John Chandos after impossible victories. Time walking through vineyards with Joan. Time watching Richard learn to read. The years no longer resembled a chain of military campaigns. They resembled moments. Bright. Ordinary. Beautiful. Fleeting. The great commander who had once measured life and conquered fortresses and victorious battles now measured it in conversations, smiles, and quiet evenings beside the people he loved. Perhaps that was always the better way to measure a life. He simply needed 45 years to discover it. Outside, the first swallows of spring circled above Windsor Castle. Inside, one of England's greatest princes prepared, knowingly or not, for the final journey every human being eventually makes. Not toward another battlefield, not toward another kingdom, but toward memory itself. The death of the Black Prince and the birth of an immortal legend. By the summer of 1376, England held its breath. The air itself seemed unusually heavy. Warm winds drifted through the gardens of Westminster Palace, carrying the scent of roses and freshly cut grass. Bees moved lazily among the flowers. The Thames reflected long ribbons of afternoon sunlight as barges glided silently toward London Bridge. The kingdom appeared peaceful, almost serene. Yet inside the palace, behind thick stone walls that had witnessed generations of triumph and tragedy, the greatest soldier England had produced in more than a century was dying. Edward no longer left his chamber often. The walks through castle gardens had ended. The long conversations around council tables had become exhausting. Even lifting a goblet sometimes required effort. His once powerful hands, capable of controlling frightened warhorses and swinging heavy swords through hours of battle, had grown noticeably thinner. Time is patient. It changes mountains grain by grain. It changes people in much the same way. The physicians continued their work. Fresh herbs arrived from monastery gardens. Expensive spices were mixed into medicinal wines. Prayers echoed through nearby chapels. Candles burned day and night. Pilgrims offered prayers for the prince's recovery across England. Some believed miracles still remained possible. Others quietly understood that medicine had reached the limits of its understanding. Sometimes the kindest treatment history offers is simply companionship. Joan rarely left his bedside. Years earlier, she had watched Edward ride away toward battlefields where arrows flew like rain. Those dangers had always seemed easier to understand. Now she faced an enemy she could neither see nor fight. She read to him from religious books. She reminded him of happier years. Sometimes they simply listened together as rain tapped softly against the palace windows. Silence between people who love one another rarely feels empty. It becomes another language entirely. Richard visited often. He was only 9 years old enough to recognize sadness, too young to understand permanence. Children possess extraordinary hope. Every morning he expected his father might somehow feel better. Every evening he left promising to return tomorrow. Edward treasured every visit. The boy would climb carefully beside him and describe lessons, games, falcon flights, or amusing incidents involving palace dogs. For a little while, the chamber no longer felt like the room of a dying prince. It became simply a father listening to his son. One afternoon, Richard asked quietly, "Father, were you ever afraid?" Edward turned slowly toward him. "Often." The boy looked surprised. "But everyone says you were the bravest knight." The prince smiled faintly. "Courage isn't the absence of fear." Richard waited. "It's choosing what matters more than fear." The child nodded thoughtfully. Whether he fully understood, no one could know. Years later, perhaps he would remember. King Edward III visited as often as age allowed. The old king now leaned heavily upon attendants while walking. Father and son had once ridden across England together. Now both moved slowly, one weakened by old age, the other by illness. During one visit, they spoke privately for nearly an hour. No chronicler recorded their conversation. Perhaps that is fitting. Some moments belong only to families, not history. One imagines memories shared, forgiveness offered where needed, gratitude expressed, love acknowledged in the quiet, understated manner so common among medieval men who had spent lifetimes expressing affection through actions rather than words. Outside the palace, political life continued relentlessly. Parliament assembled. Taxes were debated. Messengers arrived from France. The war had not paused simply because England's greatest commander lay dying. History rarely grants such courtesies. Kings die. Harvests continue. Battles resume. Markets open at dawn. The world keeps turning, sometimes with astonishing indifference. On June 8, 1376, the waiting ended. Edward of Woodstock died peacefully at Westminster Palace. He was 45 years old, only 45. Younger than many people watching this documentary tonight. Pause for a moment and consider everything contained within those 45 years. A prince at birth. A commander before adulthood. Victor at Crécy. Hero of Poitiers. Governor of Aquitaine. Conqueror in Spain. Husband. Father. Friend. Legend. Then, silence. News spread across England with remarkable speed. Church bells tolled. Messengers rode through towns and villages. Monasteries offered prayers. Ordinary people who had never met the prince spoke his name quietly. Many had grown up believing he would someday become king. Now they realized he never would. The heir to England's throne had died before his father. A succession crisis suddenly seemed possible. The future had become uncertain. Preparations began immediately for one of the grandest funerals England had ever witnessed. Edward himself had left careful instructions. He requested that his funeral reflect both his rank and his mortality. His achievements would be honored. His humanity remembered. His famous armor would accompany him, not because it had made him immortal, but because it represented the life he had lived. The funeral procession moved slowly through London's crowded streets. Thousands gathered silently. Nobles walked beside clergy. Knights lowered banners. Candles flickered despite the summer daylight. The prince's warhorse followed riderless. His shield, helmet, gauntlets, sword, all displayed before the people. The armor that had once terrified enemies now moved quietly toward a tomb. Steel survives. The hand inside it does not. Edward's body was buried in Canterbury Cathedral, one of England's holiest places. Above his tomb hung the very armor associated with his greatest victories. Visitors still see reproductions there today, while the original medieval objects have been preserved for their protection. His elaborate tomb, crafted from gilded bronze, portrayed him not as a triumphant conqueror charging into battle, but lying peacefully, hands folded in prayer. Even the greatest warrior eventually becomes still. One of the most remarkable features of Edward's tomb is its inscription. Written in medieval French, it reminds those who read it that earthly glory fades. Power ends. Beauty disappears. Strength fails. Death comes equally for kings and commoners. It is an astonishingly humble message, especially from a man whose victories reshaped Europe. Perhaps illness had taught him something battle never could. Only a year later, another bell tolled. King Edward III died in 1377. The mighty king who had ruled England for half a century followed his son into history. Since the Black Prince was already gone, the crown passed instead to young Richard. 9-year-old Richard II became King of England. The child who had once asked his father whether brave men felt fear now inherited one of Europe's most troubled kingdoms. The future would prove difficult, very difficult indeed. Meanwhile, across France, King Charles V continued reclaiming territory. One by one, English possessions slipped away. The dazzling victories of Crécy and Poitiers remained glorious memories. But memories alone could not hold castles, nor defend borders, nor feed armies. The war entered a new chapter, one fought less by legendary knights, and more through patient strategy. The age of Edward of Woodstock had ended, yet something extraordinary happened after his death. The man slowly transformed into myth. Stories grew larger. Battles became even more dramatic. Acts of generosity became almost legendary. Children heard tales of the fearless prince who defeated kings. Poets celebrated him. Chroniclers admired him. Generations who had never seen his face nevertheless felt they knew him. That mysterious title, the Black Prince, gradually eclipsed his birth name. Edward of Woodstock became history. The Black Prince became legend. And as every historian eventually learns, legends often live longer than facts. The legacy of the Black Prince, hero, warrior, and the man behind the legend. It is late now. Perhaps the room around you has grown darker than when this story began. Perhaps the only sound is the quiet hum of a fan, distant rain against a window, or the soft rhythm of your own breathing. If you've stayed with me this far, then we've traveled together across nearly half a century. We've walked beneath the ancient oaks of Woodstock. We've crossed the English Channel in crowded ships smelling of salt and wet rope. We've stood among exhausted archers at Crécy. We've watched the vineyards of Aquitaine glow beneath the evening sun. We've ridden over the snow-covered passes of the Pyrenees. We've waited beside the bed of a dying prince. And now, like every long journey through history, we arrive at the difficult question: what should we remember? History enjoys simple answers. People often ask, was Edward of Woodstock a hero? Or was he a villain? The truth, unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, refuses to cooperate. He was neither. He was both. And something more complicated besides. He was undoubtedly one of the greatest military commanders of the 14th century. Few historians seriously dispute that. At Crécy, while still a teenager, he helped demonstrate how discipline, terrain, and the English longbow could overcome armies that appeared overwhelmingly stronger. At Poitiers, he captured the King of France, an achievement so extraordinary that it permanently altered the balance of power in Western Europe. His campaigns influenced military thinking for generations. Commanders studied them. Kings admired them. Enemies adapted because of them. Even those who defeated England later often did so by learning from Edward's successes. That may be the highest compliment history can offer a soldier. Yet military brilliance never exists in isolation. Behind every famous victory stood ordinary people whose names have vanished. The longbowman who carried 2 bundles of arrows through pouring rain. The blacksmith repairing dented helmets long after midnight. The cooks somehow feeding thousands from dwindling supplies. The carpenter rebuilding broken wagons. The messenger galloping through enemy territory. The priest comforting wounded boys who would never see home again. History places great men at the center of paintings. Real history surrounds them with thousands of invisible lives. Edward understood this better than many rulers of his age. He remembered names. He walked through camps. He listened. Perhaps that is one reason his soldiers followed him so willingly. He also embodied the ideals of medieval chivalry, or at least, the best version of those ideals. He treated captured kings with dignity. He rewarded loyalty. He valued courage even in his enemies. When King John II surrendered at Poitiers, Edward did not humiliate him. He honored him. To modern eyes, that may seem merely polite. To medieval Europe, it was astonishing. Honor mattered. Reputation mattered. The manner in which one exercised power mattered. Edward recognized that victory without dignity ultimately weakens both victor and defeated. And yet, there were darker chapters. The chevauchés devastated the French countryside. Villages burned. Harvests disappeared. Families fled. The siege of Limoges remains controversial to this day. Whether hundreds died or thousands, suffering undoubtedly occurred. Edward lived in an age when warfare accepted levels of brutality that deeply disturb us now. Understanding that context does not erase the suffering. Neither should the suffering erase every other part of the man. History asks us to hold both truths together. That is rarely comfortable. It is, however, honest. His greatest enemy was never France, nor Castile, nor any rival knight. It was time. No commander defeats time. Edward survived arrows only to fall to illness. He crossed continents only to discover there are journeys the strongest horse cannot carry us through. There is something profoundly human about that. The legend wore blackened armor. The man beneath it suffered pain, grief, uncertainty, and loss exactly as countless others have. Perhaps his most remarkable quality was not courage in battle. Many knights displayed courage. Perhaps it was discipline. He prepared constantly. He listened. He observed. He learned from mistakes. After Crécy, he did not assume victory made him infallible. After Poitiers, he continued asking questions. Even while governing Aquitaine, he traveled among his people rather than ruling only through reports. Curiosity remained one of his greatest weapons. Curiosity often outlives strength. His marriage to Joan of Kent offers another reminder that history rarely fits neat stereotypes. Royal marriages frequently serve diplomacy more than affection. Theirs appears different. Their surviving letters and contemporary accounts suggest genuine companionship. She advised him, protected him, cared for him through illness. He trusted her, respected her, loved her. Behind the famous warrior stood a partnership rarely celebrated enough. Behind many great historical figures, you will often find someone quietly making greatness possible. Then there is Richard, the little boy who inherited a kingdom instead of a father. Edward never became king. That remains one of English history's great what-if questions. What kind of monarch might he have been? Would the peasants' revolt have unfolded differently? Would England have pursued another strategy in France? Would Richard II's troubled reign have been avoided entirely? No historian can answer. History records what happened, not what almost happened. Still, the imagination occasionally wanders. Even his nickname remains mysterious. The Black Prince. Dark armor? Fear inspired among enemies? Later invention? Some forgotten story now lost forever? Perhaps the uncertainty somehow improves the legend. Not every mystery requires solving. Some simply remind us how incomplete our understanding of the past truly is. History resembles an old tapestry. Magnificent, detailed, beautiful, and full of missing threads. If you were to visit Canterbury Cathedral today, you would find Edward's magnificent tomb still resting beneath its soaring stone arches. Sunlight filters through medieval stained glass. The air remains cool, even during summer. Footsteps echo softly across ancient floors polished smooth by centuries of pilgrims. Visitors pause before the prince's effigy. Some arrive knowing every battle. Others know only the nickname. Many simply stand quietly, because there is something deeply moving about seeing the resting place of someone who once seemed larger than life. His armor no longer marches. His banners no longer flutter above armies. His voice has long since fallen silent. Yet somehow, he still tells a story. And perhaps that is the true purpose of history. Not to worship great people, not to condemn them, but to understand them. To recognize ourselves inside lives separated from ours by nearly 7 centuries. Edward laughed. So do we. He worried about family. So do we. He struggled with illness. So do we. He hoped the future would be kinder to his children. So do we. The centuries between us begin to feel surprisingly thin, as the candles burned low in medieval castles, as the watchmen called the passing hours from ancient walls, as horses shifted quietly in their stables after long campaigns. Edward of Woodstock could never have imagined that people hundreds of years later would still whisper his name before falling asleep. Not because he was perfect, not because every decision he made deserves admiration, but because he lived fully inside one of history's most extraordinary ages. He reminds us that greatness and imperfection can exist within the same human heart, that courage often walks beside doubt, that glory fades, that kindness endures, and that even the loudest legends eventually become gentle echoes carried through time. So tonight, as the fires in Westminster slowly fade into glowing embers, as the vineyards of Aquitaine disappear beneath the quiet mist, as the fields of Crécy and Poitiers rest peacefully under moonlight, let the Black Prince ride one last time across the hills of medieval England, not toward another battle, not toward another victory, but into the calm, endless landscape of memory, where history no longer rushes, where swords have fallen silent, where the horses no longer tire, and where, at last, even the greatest warrior can finally rest. Good night.